How should we think about health? Well, here's how I think of my personal health. I don't sleep enough, I don't exercise enough, I eat the wrong food. In other words, just because I feel okay now, I act as if I don't need to do anything to make sure I feel okay later. But one day, I'll fall ill and then I'll be at my doctor's clinic saying, kindly give medicines. I will be disciplined in taking them. I care about my health. This is the wrong approach. My thinking about my personal health care is flawed, and I will only realize it when I fall ill, and then if I get better, I will forget it again. And that's our nation's attitude towards healthcare, especially if we are among the urbanized English speaking elites. We feel okay most of the time, and when we don't, we have access to fancy doctors and fancier hospitals. We don't spend time worrying about our healthcare system. And yet, we are now in the middle of a crisis where we can't ignore it anymore. You could say, as a nation, as a democracy, we are suffering the impact of a chronic disease that we had earlier normalized. And it is now making us suffer. COVID-19 has made it clear that our healthcare system is broken. As much as that, it has also revealed that our dysfunctional state is a greater crisis than COVID-19. In fact, our dysfunctional state is a chronic crisis that we have been suffering from for over 70 years. Now, maybe fixing the state is beyond us, but we must ask ourselves, how can we fix our healthcare system? We need to do it, and we need to start now, before COVID-19 recedes and we slip back into our bubbles of denial. And before we fix it, we need to understand it.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Varma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen. My guest today is a brilliant economist, Karthik Muralidharan. Karthik had last appeared on episode 185 of this show, which as of now is the third most downloaded episode of mine. It was a comprehensive discussion on our education system, and we had promised each other that we would one day have a similar long chat about our healthcare system, another subject that Karthik has studied deeply. Well, that day has come when the subject feels so immediate and visceral, and not just something that academics and policy wonks should care about. Now, just as that earlier episode was titled Fixing Indian Education, I thought of calling this one Fixing Indian Healthcare. But we both agreed that it seems almost arrogant to say that we know how to fix this. This is such a deep problem that we first need to try and understand it. Thus this title, Understanding Indian Healthcare. Now it so happens that Karthik is writing a book about fixing the Indian state, and he sent me the early draft of his chapter on healthcare. I can't share that chapter with you, but the show notes contain many of the papers that are mentioned there, which give a foundational understanding of our healthcare system. I encourage you, don't just listen to this episode, also go through those papers. We all have a stake in this thing. Karthik and I have also agreed in a few weeks from now to do another episode on federalism in India. Now, one thing I found delightful about this particular conversation is that it felt like it was part of a larger ongoing conversation spanning many episodes of mine. Karthik wrote to me and offered to have this conversation after listening to my episode on vaccines with Ajay Shah. And during this conversation, he kept quoting previous guests such as Ashwin Mahesh and Anirban Mahapatra, adding to their insights and carrying their arguments forward. This is the best thing about The Seen and the Unseen, as regular listeners would have realized. And by the way, Karthik and I disagreed on quite a few things in this episode, such as the high petrol prices because of how much the government taxes, which I feel is a bad thing, but Karthik feels is a good thing. And that actually illustrates another fundamental disagreement between us. He has faith that the dysfunctional state can be reformed, and while I would love all efforts towards that to continue, I feel that we must stop depending on the state and try to figure out how society can solve its own problems. But that's a larger ongoing conversation, and what we both agreed on is that we need to understand this problem first before we think about how to solve it. And some of Karthik's insights in this episode are just stunning. And so is his singing. Yes, my friends, we have a little Antakshari session at the end of this episode, and Karthik sings a couple of songs for us. And why not? Music is the best medicine. But before we get there, let's take a quick commercial break. Do you want to read more? I've put in a lot of work in recent years in building a reading habit. This means that I read more books, but I also read more long form articles and essays. There's a world of knowledge available through the internet. But the problem we all face is, how do we navigate this knowledge? How do we know what to read? How do we put the right incentives in place for us? Well, I discovered one way. A couple of friends of mine run this awesome company called CTQ Compounds at ctqcompounds.com, which aims to help people uplevel themselves by reading more. A few months ago, I signed up for one of their programs called The Daily Reader. Every day for 6 months, they sent me a long form article to read. The subjects covered went from machine learning to mythology to mental models to even marmalade. This helped me build a habit of reading. At the end of every day, I understood the world a little better than I did before. So if you want to build your reading habit, head on over to CTQ Compounds and check out their Daily Reader. The next batch starts on Saturday, May 23rd. And if you're listening to this after that date, they keep having regular batches. They also have another great program called Future Stack, which helps you stay up to date with ideas, skills, and mental models that will help you stay relevant in the future. Future Stack batches start every Saturday. Also check out the Social Capital Compound, which helps you master social media. What's more, on all of these, you get a discount of a whopping 2,500 rupees, rupees 2,500, if you use the discount code UNSEEN. So head on over to CTQ Compounds at ctqcompounds.com and use the code UNSEEN. Uplevel yourself. Karthik, welcome back to The Seen and the Unseen.
Thank you, Amit. It's a pleasure to be back.
You know, when we did our episode on education, episode 185, which was so incredibly popular, we had sort of left a teaser for the listeners that one day we will talk about healthcare. And hey, that day has come in rather difficult times where healthcare has become not just some abstract issue, but it's really touching everybody's lives here in intimate and sometimes really sad ways. Tell me, how have the last few months been for you? Because, we have, of course, faced this global pandemic, and you are, given what's happening in India, you are very close to it because so many people close to you must be here and getting affected. At the same time, you're far away. At another intellectual level, you're closer to it than most people because you understand all the fault lines in our healthcare system, which we'll talk about as we go along, and all the fault lines in the Indian state as we'll go along. So just at a personal level, how has it been for you, emotionally and just in terms of your intellectual pursuits? During this time, you've also been writing this book, which I can't wait to read, on, fixing the Indian state. So just tell me a little bit about how it's been for you over the last few months.
Yeah, thanks, Amit. I think the last month has been particularly difficult. The most kind of difficult part in some ways has been this is the longest 15 months I have not traveled to India. I mean, normally I come every 2 to 3 months. And I had gotten my vaccines in early March, and I was really looking forward to making a trip, in fact, in late April, early May. And that is clearly not feasible right now. But more than that, just seeing how this situation has exploded in the past month, I think it is very surreal to be kind of physically safe where I am in the US, but kind of mentally essentially facing as much, if not all, of the stresses and turmoils of parents and friends and people who are affected. No, it's been very, very difficult. I think there are obviously things you can do from here in terms of donations and stuff, but I'm also trying to apply my mind to the few policy things that could be done. And, we'll talk more about that going forward. So, I think just applying first principles to sensible design of healthcare systems, and how do you kind of use this moment of kind of reckoning almost about the weakness of our healthcare systems to make the right investments going forward. So, just like we say about the 91 reforms, the crisis by itself was not enough to have the reforms. You also needed the blueprint to be ready of what you're going to do. And so my hope is that some of the analytical principles we'll talk about today, can be useful in kind of the nation's reactions to this moment of crisis in terms of the kind of investments we'll make going forward.
So there are a couple of thoughts I have. Obviously, we want to talk about healthcare in general and really maybe talk a little bit about COVID at the end. And I've had a few episodes on COVID already, so I don't want to give my listeners too much more of that depressing subject right now. But this kind of comes up as a pertinent question to ask you, which is that there are two aspects of the pandemic that I've noted. One, the smaller one, almost a trivial one that I chatted about with Anup Malani in the episode I did with him, is that it inverted some of our values. Like some of the things which could otherwise be considered good suddenly worked against us, like population density, which we know is good, which is why people go to cities. You've got larger economic networks, more people together, more opportunities, all of that. But in the context of this pandemic, that suddenly, became a bit of a con. But that's a trivial minor thing. The larger thing that I noticed, and I wrote a column about it last year in April when this first began, stating that our greater crisis is not just COVID, which will pass, but the dysfunctional Indian state, which has been in crisis for the last 70 years. I think in that column I used a stat, I don't really remember it, but something like 3,000 children in India die of starvation every day, something like that. I'm sure you have kind of better stats, which to me is indicative of an ongoing disaster which we have completely normalized. And if there's one thing that COVID has done, it has shed light on a lot of things which we had normalized. The apathy of politicians, the dysfunctional state, more than anything else, the fact that the state simply doesn't work. I mean, I've always said that where the state is most required, most justified, it is absent. There is effectively no rule of law in India. And today we see that in the state of our healthcare, where it was most required, it was absent, and we are kind of seeing the consequences of that. So do you think that there is also, therefore, a teachable moment in this, that you can look at this moment and say that, listen, these things have been wrong forever, right? We haven't noticed them. Right now, you are all looking at them because they are stark, they are in relief. Now, this is a time where we have to therefore sit down and at an intellectual level analyze the problem, because it's clear, we can see it, and there is a will to do that, and then think about what to do. Is this something that you've thought about? And as someone who studied the inner workings of both the state and healthcare so deeply for so many years, is that how you see it? That these are things that were there and now these fault lines are becoming stark?
Yeah, no, I think I've been rewriting many parts of the introduction of the book. I started the first chapters 2 years ago, right? Well, before the pandemic. I think those of us who have been studying the state have kind of known about these weaknesses and known that there was kind of a gradual atrophy, right? I think Ajay also talked a little bit about why state capacity is weaker now than it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. And frankly, I think as with all of these things, it's multi-causal, right? And we can get into that. But I think in terms of the book, it almost feels like in a macabre way, right? I mean that it is kind of, it is hopefully rises to the moment, right? Because the book is called Fixing the Indian State, but hopefully the one silver lining from all of this disaster is that people realize that this is no longer something that we can allow to kind of rest. So coming to the different reasons for why I think we've underinvested the state, one of the downsides of liberalization, I think it was positive in almost every way, right? But is it has also led to a complete seceding of the elite, right? From being recipients of public services, right? So the Indian elites and policymaking classes, any taxpayer, it pretty much avails of private healthcare, private education, private security, and private whatever you can, right? And so one way to characterize the current moment, it's almost like the elites and middle classes have been flying first in business class in the plane that is India, right? And kind of surrounding them with creature comforts. But now is the moment when you realize when the plane crashes, it takes you all down, regardless of what class you're flying in. There is obviously the hyper rich or the private jet types who are leaving the country, right? But except for that type, I think the rest of us are kind of in this plane together, and sometimes physically not, but emotionally we are. At least that's my case. Hopefully, this is one of those wake-up calls as we would have wanted to approach the 75th year of independence in a moment of kind of, feeling great pride at what we've achieved. But, sometimes you need these kind of rude wake-up calls to really look at how hollow the state is inside and build and start working on the systematic project of building up. As academics and intellectuals, we can contribute to this public discourse with a certain amount of conceptual clarity and analysis. And then in terms of taking it forward, it's obviously the larger community of state citizens and civil society. So, in that way, I hope. Yeah, so timing wise, I think I'm about 95% done with the first complete draft of the book. So it's almost done. But the problem, of course, is that as an academic, the default first drafts tend to be very defensive because academic writing, you write every sentence assuming a peer reviewer is going to come pounce on you and saying, how did you say this? How did you say that? And so, so in that sense, there's still substantial editing needed. I think the first draft you've seen in the chapter I've sent you has a lot of content, but it's still very terse. And so it'll probably another 6-8 months of serious editing, but I'm hoping the book will be able to hit the stand sometime next year, and coincidentally leading into the 75th year of independence, and hopefully can be part of the national conversation at that time about what we need to do.
And hopefully will remain part of the national conversation because I'm really looking forward to it. I think it's an important book. I'll come back to the book in a moment because I do want to talk a bit more about the book, the process of writing it, editing it, almost workshopping it with your students as you kind of discussed before we started. But Another sort of question, which is something that I've been thinking about over the last few days, but before that, a little story I'd like to share with you and my listeners. And this concerns a dear friend of mine. Both his parents got COVID and were in different ICUs in different hospitals in Delhi. And his dad was in a hospital called Jaipur Golden. There were 21 beds in the surgery ICU there, and he was in that particular ICU. And one night, oxygen ran out, 20 people died. So only his dad survived, the other 20 died. And his dad was devastated because the next day, everybody else who was a patient in the ward with him was taken away in a body bag. And his dad is still struggling and fighting it out. And my friend's mom died a few days later, though she was getting better. He thought that she'll get better. He was worried about his dad. And the failure of the state, the failure of everything, our politics, the state, everything was so stark. And he called me and he said ki kuch karna parega, that everything is broken. It's up to us to fix it. We have to do something. And his first thought in his deeply emotional state was ki politics mein kuch karte hain. And me being the cynic that I am, I said that usse kuch nahi hoga, because politics is the supply end of the political marketplace. Jab tak demand end mein kuch hoga nahi, politics mein kuch nahi hoga. And also, what will happen if you become a successful politician? You'll take charge of the state. The state is dysfunctional. The state will remain dysfunctional, right? That's my negative view, which I've always held, which you're kind of aware of. So I said ki nahi yaar, usse kuch nahi hoga. You can't have hopes from the state. What you have to do, if these problems are to be solved, they have to be solved by private individuals. You got to figure out ways to solve it. And like you've pointed out, the rich and the elite, and I loved your metaphor of the plane called India, and these people are flying first in business, but it's going to crash. I love that metaphor. It's stunning. But the thing is, how the rich and the elite have been getting so far is that they've insulated themselves from the state, right? They've done their jugaad and they've got everything worked out. And now they realize, damn it, we're in the same plane together. So just as they've insulated themselves, a lot of these problems, it seems to me, of the state, I don't have much hope for much happening from the state. At most, you make incremental, marginal improvements. Now, you had spoken to me in the episode where you gave so much insight on education. You said that at the level of the state, when you're talking of that kind of scale, even a marginal improvement can touch hundreds of thousands of millions of people, in fact, and therefore it's worth it. But, it kind of strikes me in this dark moment that we can't have hope from the state anymore. If things get better with the state, that's fine. It'll happen over time. It's a long game. But private individuals have to kind of step in. And therefore, the larger question, which perhaps I should have asked after we discussed all our healthcare problems and so on, but it seems like an apposite time to ask it, is that when we talk of the problems in the Indian state, in our healthcare, for example, and we say that, of course, the state has to do it. And I agree with you there that, the positive externalities, if everyone is healthy, are so huge that, of course, the state has to do it, especially in a poor country like India. But if the problem is not getting solved from there, then private people have to step in and find ways to do it. What are your thoughts on this? I'm sorry if I rambled a bit.
The question is absolutely spot on. And see, the book for the most part is addressed to senior policymakers, right? Because that's kind of that's the audience that has the capacity and the locus standi to actually fix the state. But my final chapter on making it happen, right, is essentially about state, citizen, and civil society. That's kind of speaking to some of these points that you're talking about. And in fact, that's the one chapter that's not yet written. I have an outline, but precisely because I think it's evolving so much as we see, right? So India does have an incredible tradition of civil society. Yeah, there's no shortage of very, very well-minded, well-motivated, sincere organizations trying to do a lot of good. And I do think there's a lot to be said there. Now, I think the challenge is what I've seen in the space is that there is a lot of distributed subscale initiatives, right? That people do in different places, and thinking about how do you leverage that general angst that citizens have, that they want to shape their surroundings for the common good. How do you take that and channel that enthusiasm and desire in a constructive way? So one of the big things that's happened between the last podcast and this is, like, I have gone back and heard so many more of your episodes, and the lockdown has helped me in the sense that the only exercise I have is long walks. And so just as an academic always makes cross references. The first time I came on the show, I hadn't really heard many of the past ones. Now I have heard. So I'll make connections to a lot more of your previous episodes here, right? But I think Ashwin has multiple episodes, has said this incredibly, I think, powerfully. locally, right? So start local, but instead of saying that I am going to go and create some organization that does something, if you go sit with your local municipal council, if you go sit with your local public health guys, the guys who are doing the sewage, and then understand how can you leverage their existence as opposed to try to do something in parallel, right? Because the thing when you do something in parallel is you have, so I mean, this is a complete digression, but I guess we've done a 1 hour digression in the past. But and one of the things I'll talk about in that last chapter is there is a range of philanthropic civil society actions, right? There are organizations like, say, the Red Cross and Doctors Without Borders, and organizations, and you had a show on feeding the hungry, right? I mean, during the pandemic, right? So there are organizations that do what I call immediate humanitarian relief, right? I mean, alleviating human suffering, okay? And that's incredibly important in the moment, because if you can't survive that moment, in the long run, you're dead, okay? So, but that's very, very important. That's one kind of civil society, right? Then there are civil society actions that say, let me come and build a school or build a hospital or build something where I want to build a certain center of excellence, and I will cross-subsidize access to the poor, and maybe I will create something that the rich are willing to pay for, and there are different models of that. And the reason people do that is because you're well-minded, you want to do something institutional as opposed to just give immediate relief, but you know that if you were to just fund the state, then it goes into the morass of the bureaucracy, and so you want to preserve a certain amount of operational autonomy on your school or your hospital, and that you can run it to high standards, okay? So that's another model of civil society, right? Then there are models of civil society action that focus a lot more on citizen awareness and building rights, okay? And which I think is, again, very, very important. And this has, to the extent that a big part of the dysfunctional state is that the people it is meant to serve are often not empowered enough to hold it accountable, right? I mean, that there are a lot to be said for that, okay? But I think here is the problem with that. Again, the problem with this book right now is that each chapter could well be a book in itself, right? I mean, and I have this longish academic discussion of why has democracy, right? I mean, per se, not delivered for India in the way that we would think it should, right? I mean, and the argument is quite subtle, right? Because it's basically democracy has helped in terms of expanding the ability of people to make claims on the state, okay? But what it has not done is expand the capacity of the state to deliver on those claims, right? I mean, so when you go in activist mode and saying, I'm going to kind of teach people their rights and go and ask them to kind of, mobilize better, that's useful, but it very quickly hits the capacity constraint of the state itself, right? Because essentially the state has so limited resources in terms of budget and bandwidth that you're just kind of moving the attention from the place that's shouting less to the place that's shouting more, okay? So the real impact will come when you can expand the supply and kind of enhance the capacity of the state to deliver. And the state is a metaphor really for all of us, right? So, and again, I'll elaborate on this a lot more in terms of both what individuals and civil society can do. But my broad thinking right now is that ways in which we can leverage the existing state and help it work better are going to give you the highest ROI. And not everybody is going to go sit at the state level and start changing policy. But in your local, in your city council, to the extent that itself is a collective good, right? I mean, that could be a very, very good place to start. So again, this was unplanned. I thought we were going to talk about health, but we always have this habit of doing digressions, but hopefully some of
digressions are great. I mean, my whole modus operandi of learning about the world is thinking aloud and having people either fill in the gaps in my knowledge or add to it and so on. So I'll take another digression from this digressive digression, which is that you mentioned that our democracy has worked in terms of making people feel empowered enough to make demands of the state, but it hasn't worked in the other way of the state having capacity to actually deliver on those demands. So my question is that the reason the state hasn't developed that capacity is also a question of incentives, because our government is not local enough. That if our government was incredibly local, that if, I had done an episode on, I think a very old episode with Shruti Rajgopalan on local governance and all of that. And she pointed out that if you just look at Maharashtra, right, the person that you vote for, your municipal councillor or whoever, has practically no power to do anything to improve your life. And the person who does have all that power, the state government and all that, they don't want your vote. Their vote bank is something else. So there is a disconnect between power and accountability. And the more local that government gets, the more accountability there is. And therefore, if they were accountable to you, they would build the capacity to serve you.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to punt on this to our future episode on federalism. And then
okay.
Because I think last time we said, we put teasers of multiple future episodes. So we'll do health today and then but I will come
We'll
back
do
to
federalism
this
some other time. Okay, but before we get to health, let's kind of get to your book. Tell me a little bit about your book, the process of writing it, the process of kind of workshopping it, and also the other interesting aspect, which is that does teaching teach you, in the sense that if you think about there being, like, I think in an earlier episode with me, Krish Ashok had spoken about this pyramid of learning, where, your learning is most shallow if you just listen to something, it's a little deeper if you read it, and so on down the way, and it's deepest if you teach it, I think. So in your case, you mentioned that one of the ways you workshopped the book was you also taught bits of it. Did the process of teaching it, having to pare everything down to a systematic structure, explain it in simple language, answer questions on it, did that deepen your understanding? And in general, does, through your career, you've obviously been an incredible researcher, that's a matter of public record, but you've also taught. So what's the relationship there between teaching and learning?
There's a reason why top research universities have this positive feedback loop between research and teaching, right? So there's no question about it that the act of putting together a lecture and teaching forces you to distill both what you want your audience to understand and how do we know what we know. I'm forgetting his name now because his handle is Bhalo Manush, right? But 4 episodes. Anirban. Yeah. So, but what Anirban mentioned, right? That when he got to the US, his first exam, he bombed it because all his life he'd been taught how to spit out the facts as opposed to kind of ask where do those facts come from, right? And I think one of the first things I say is your typical rote learning system teaches you to answer questions. It doesn't teach you to question the answers. But good teaching is all about not just teaching you something, but teaching you principles, teaching you how to think, right? I remember, I think in my first class, one of my freshman year classes, I think it was a chemistry class, I think being taught by I can't remember, it was either a Nobel laureate or somebody of similar eminence, where he said, listen, you've gotten here essentially by solving exams, but, when you get into the lab, right, there is no script, right? There is no script because you're by construction facing a new problem, right? And so what you're going to get is just a set of principles of how you're going to approach and navigate when you're in uncharted territory. So I think coming back to good teaching, what I did with this particular book teaching was, to be honest, the first draft which I taught, I committed to teaching a seminar class mainly as a commitment device to myself, to force myself to get that first draft done because I needed to give the chapters to the students while teaching it. So it was a seminar class of about 16 to 18 students, and the book has 18 chapters and the class had 20 lectures. So one intro, one conclusion. And then for each lecture, I would basically assign them a chapter 72 hours in advance. And then students would read it and submit a 2-page response paper before the class. And I just wanted them to basically have 3 categories of notes. First is the 3 to 5 things that they learned, the most important things they learned from the chapter. The second is what are the things they're still confused about or unclear about. And third is, what are the ideas they have for strengthening the chapter, whether it's with facts or some students had some ideas for cartoons, which, I think will be great when I get a chance, or just, other ways of making the points come across better. So I required that before the class. So that was a commitment device that the students had to do the reading. So then coming to effective teaching, the best teaching is not when you're repeating the lecture, but if people have done the reading and then you come from the beginning with a set of questions and you're engaging in the discussion. So I think, that was a lot of fun. Now, like I said, the first draft of the book is still very, very, very terse because essentially, I'm just trying to synthesize a huge body of research and get it across. But what's going to take a lot of time in the editing and where the student feedback will help is to say, okay, now how do you simplify? Because my hope is that this is a book that is both essentially readable for your, airport reader and is viable as a textbook in any class in kind of public policy. So the challenge is, of course, there's lots and lots and lots of books in India written kind of in a more experiential way, right? And I think what hopefully makes this book different is just how much research there is. So you kind of want to convey the depth of the research without necessarily getting people bogged down in the details. So the challenge is to then put those in footnotes, perhaps create like an online appendix to the entire book that will then have the studies and some of the more detailed technical pieces there, so that becomes an accompaniment to people who want to teach with it. But that's kind of where I am right now. So I think I'm about 95% of the way done. But like we said last time, the podcast is so much fun because I can jump and make connections, right? Because the way the book is structured is set up around a set of themes and then a set of sectors. And the hardest part is there is so many cross connections across everything in the book, but the book by construction is linear, right? So how do you make each chapter fully self-contained while at the same time not repeat what's in other places, right? So in writing, say, an education chapter, a health chapter, right? I mean, if I say go back and look at this chapter and state in the market about how do you regulate, go back and look at this chapter on measurement, go back and look at this chapter on federalism, then it's kind of, anyway, so that's, I think, the hardest part. I think somebody transcribed our education podcast and came to about 40,000 words. And so sometimes I really wonder, why am I wasting 3 years writing a book when I can do 4 podcasts with you and be done in like half a day,
No, it's not a waste, because I've read one chapter of it and I cannot wait to read the full book. I think, one of the things, on a very serious note, I'm glad that you're writing this book that Ajay and Vijay Kelkar wrote in service of the Republic. I think, these books together, and hopefully there'll be many more like them, will form a body of work which a student of public policy in India will, or anywhere for that matter, will be able to look at to get different sort of foundational understandings which are really important. And I'm just thinking aloud, you spoke about how, the book is so interconnected and how do you express those interconnections. And I've been taking all my notes for my episodes recently in this app called Rome Research, which has something called bidirectional linking, where, within the category of health, I could be talking about, say, regulation. But regulation itself is a massive category which has 5 subcategories. So somewhere a subcategory becomes a super category and all of that shit happens. And the software kinda allows for that, but you feel like that maybe there are even more refined versions that are kind of happening in the future. And a book is really old technology. So
exactly. No, I mean, and I think what I like about reading books in Kindles these days is because you can click to the references, right? So I think because the academic part of me, when I read something, half the time I want to click the reference and kind of, check that. So yes, so having more digital books that are able to just hyperlink back, right? And so in fact, sometimes I remember a piece of advice I got when I was in the academic job market, right? The faculty job market is when you go for a faculty job, you kind of get these half-an-hour interviews where people ask you all kinds of questions and you have no idea what they're going to ask you. So one of the things was what you train your students in terms of preparing for a job interview is to kind of think about their first 3 to 5 minute spiel as the front page of a web page, right? And then, but there are hyperlinks based on what questions they're going to ask you, right? And so you need to be able to drill 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 levels below. So, if you're, say, an econometrics candidate and you're being interviewed by faculty members, one is in macro, one is in micro, one is in econometrics, one is in development. The people outside your field will ask some interesting applied questions, but that might be 1 level deep, right? The people in your field will go 5 levels deep. And your challenge is not just to answer, but once you finish the answer, to come back to the front page and kind of continue the narrative without kind of getting lost in the weeds, right? So again, when you have the experience, each year you read more and more and more, that mental filing system expands in a way that you make more and more and more of the connections, which is why I think after 20 years of this work, I felt ready to write this book, right? Because till now, most of the work as an academic is writing deep individual papers, but those papers don't really make the connections across what's happening. And so the book is a chance to make those connections. Now, that being said, the linearity of the written word is still quite vexing, right? I mean, but it is what it is.
That's absolutely kind of fascinating. Now, tell me about how healthcare, because if one goes on YouTube and searches for Karthik Muralitharan, besides of course our episode together, you'll also find a lot of talks you've given on education, and that makes sense. So I was trying to kind of make sense of this, that okay, he's an expert in education, everyone knows this. How has he also gotten into healthcare? And then I remembered something that you told me in our last episode, where in the introduction you spoke about how the first person you named as an intellectual influence on you was Amartya Sen. And Amartya Sen, of course, built this capabilities framework about what individuals kind of need to reach their full potential. And that had 2 prongs to it. And one was education and one was health. So it was like, voila, okay, that's why. So I hope I'm not being too flippant, but tell me a little bit more about how you got into it, why you got into it, what your journey doing health economics was like. Because one of the things that I've kind of noticed is that the body of work that you have is exciting. The body of work, all of these other economists who've done all of these papers, when seen as a cumulative whole, is exciting. But each individual paper seems to be, like a lot of kind of stodgy legwork and a lot of just gathering data, just to say that, so many people are absent. You are doing such a long study over such a period of time when, it's common sense, they are absent only,
Mm-hmm.
So how does that process work out? And in a sense, you just described your mental process where you do a lot of little concrete micro things and then they begin to form a bigger picture. And it's to illuminate that bigger picture that, you're writing the book. But how has that process of being a health economist been like for you? Why did you get into it? Like, if you are interested in the big questions, then how do you figure out which are the small things to dive into first, or is it happenstance? Take me through a little bit of this, because the world of academics, both fascinates me and intimidates me, especially now when you talk about at an interview, you have to go 5 levels deep and come back up. And I'm like, what is this? I'm just a person who you would have noticed I just go deep. There's no front page. So tell me.
Yeah, and thanks for asking that question, because the truth is I'm not a health economist and I shouldn't pretend to be one, right? But thinking about health permeates a lot of, my larger thinking and teaching and some of my research as well. So I think one of the things I want to do for your listeners is partly because I see, I really liked Ajay's episode, and I see this almost as building off on that, where he said, one of the things we need is really building a community of young researchers and scholars in the health research community. So I see part of my goal here is almost excite, say, college goers or master's students to say what a wonderful, amazing field health economics is and how much there is to do. So I think in terms of my own personal entry points into health, they come from 3 angles, right? So the first is public finance, right? So at heart, I'm a public finance economist, right? So my core fields are public finance and development. And in public finance, right, health ends up accounting for over 20-25% of public spending in developed countries, and which is, where I've studied. And so when you take public finance in the US, a big part of your coursework is in fact health economics. It almost becomes like a subset because that's where the government's money is going. They say follow the money, right? So and in fact, one of my advisors, so Michael Kramer was one of them, but the other one, I had 3 of them, but the other one was Marty Feldstein, who was one of the, the giants of US public finance, and also one of the people who kind of almost created the modern field of health economics, right? Because I think just like Ajay was saying, there used to be a tradition where health was left to doctors and education was left to educators, but policy is fundamentally about allocating scarce resources, and so you kind of need an economic lens in this, right? So the public finance aspects of why healthcare is occupies a large share of my mind space is that there are fundamental questions about how much public expenditure should they be, right? What should we be spending this on? Given that there are other competing claims on public resources, how do you increase and optimize the effectiveness of your public expenditure? So the unifying thread in all of my research is really improving effectiveness of public expenditure. And like I said last time, the sectors I work on are sectors where the government spends over 10,000 crores a year, right? So education, health, NREGA, PDS, now ICDS. So essentially improving then the effectiveness of that by even 1% is going to give you a huge bang for the buck, right? So my first kind of entry point into health economics is through public finance, and I'll come back and talk about what we've learned from that approach. The second one is development economics, right? So that is my core field. I teach both undergrad and PhD classes in development economics, and health is a substantial part of what you teach. And going back to Amartya Sen, so both health and education have this unique place because they are both what we call intrinsically important and instrumentally important, right? So the traditional economist Chicago view of health and education is human capital, right? It's human capital because these are investments that make you more productive. So a healthy worker is more productive. A more educated worker is more productive, right? Whereas the Senian inversion, so to speak, right, is that health and education are not just about making you more productive, but these are the intrinsic goals of development, right? That because people care about living healthy lives, regardless of whether you're productive, it is good to be educated and be a more sophisticated consumer of the world around you, regardless of whether it makes you more productive, right? So in that sense, health and education occupy like a special place in development because of both this instrumental and intrinsic importance. So if you go look at, say, the Human Development Index, which Sen inspired, essentially what it's doing is saying the traditional measures of development are just GDP per capita. But the GDP, you can't eat GDP. The whole point of GDP is to kind of live a better life. And health and education are intrinsically so important that the HDI then has a 1/3 weight on health, a 1/3 weight on education, and a 1/3 weight on GDP per capita. So health becomes central in development economics that way, but also in 2 other very important ways. I think when you think about development economics, what is development economics, right? How is development economics different from just being about reducing poverty, right? And so the conceptual key point about development economics is the idea of poverty traps, right? The idea that people can be in initial conditions that make them them so vulnerable that they cannot bootstrap their way out of that initial condition. Okay. So one of the contrasts I would say between public finance and development is when you do public finance in the US or in any developed country, the de facto understanding you have is that there is almost always a trade-off between equity and efficiency. That you want to do some redistribution because you want to support the poor, but that redistribution will almost always reduce efficiency in the economy. And why is that? It's because to redistribute, I need to raise taxes on the rich, and that's going to reduce incentives to work. I'm going to give out something for free, which may reduce incentives to work. And then the most kind of, I think, important but underappreciated part is that if I'm targeting something to the poor, okay, then by construction, I need to phase out that benefit as you get richer, right? Because I'm giving it to the poor. So at some point, as you earn more, I have to phase it out, correct? But that phase out often creates a very high marginal tax rate for the poor, right? So often for every dollar I earn, I might be losing 50 cents in benefits, okay? So suppose at $20,000 or less, you're getting free health insurance, okay, through Medicaid, and then you earn $30,000, you become ineligible. Let's say this benefit is worth $5,000, okay? So effectively, when I'm going from 20,000 to 30,000, I have a marginal tax rate of 50% because I'm losing $1 of benefits for every 50 cents of benefits every dollar I'm earning. And then in a funny way, that can actually create a poverty trap by itself because now you've reduced the incentives to work out of that, out of that place of poverty. So the general thinking in a lot of public finance and public economics is that there is this inevitable trade-off, but because we care about equity intrinsically, right? I mean, as a society, you care about some redistribution. But what is, I think, very nice in development is that we have a whole class of models where you show that when people are close to subsistence poverty, that there is often no trade-off between equity and efficiency. That a well-designed social welfare program, a well-designed intervention can not only improve equity, but also improve efficiency. That you're making people more productive and therefore able to pay back. So, for example, there's a brand new paper which I just released this week on the ICDS, which is the Integrated Child Development Services. And at one level, it's a very simple paper. It's a very simple paper because we're just looking at what is the impact of adding an extra worker, okay, focused on preschool education. And in fact, some people said, do you really need an RCT to go study this? The point is not, does it have an impact? The point is to quantify the impact and show that the public rate of return on this is about 12 to 20 times the cost. And therefore, if you were to invest in this, you will increase productivity enough that your future discounted tax revenue increases will more than pay for the program. So I think the point is, in a world of limited resources, when everybody wants funding for everything, the holy grail for a policymaker or policy analyst is to saying, can I find a class of policies that improve both equity and efficiency so that I am both supporting redistributive justice, but doing this in a way that is not just about distributing a fixed pie, but doing this in a way that expands the size of the pie, right? There are a class of policies that do that, but you need to do a lot of heavy kind of lifting in terms of both thinking and empirics to kind of design and implement those programs, right? See, but again, the point is that's why it plays such a big role in development economics, thinking about health, because the idea of a nutrition-based poverty trap or health-based poverty trap are some of the oldest ideas in development economics. Now, there is a third strand in development, which is very, very kind of exciting, which is when you think about development economics, in general, you expect poor countries to be able to grow faster than rich countries. And there's basically two reasons for that. One is you start with a much lower capital stock, okay? And so the marginal returns to capital are higher, okay? So the US Treasury may be giving you 1%, 2% because this is a capital-rich society. You don't have those same high return opportunities, whereas the returns to capital investment are much, much higher. So automatically, you would expect poor countries to grow faster. But the other big reason why you would expect poor countries to grow faster is that it's much easier to adopt an existing technology than to invent new technologies at the frontier, okay? So if you think about just this corona crisis, right? I mean, the reason we are even in this place of talking about vaccinations is because you've had the entire research infrastructure of the developed world, right? Like, I mean, go after this virus and crack this in about a year, right? So in that sense, for a development economist, in a way, the advantage of being away from the frontier is that you just have to focus on adoption. But then the big question is, why are there so many kind of free lunches left on the sidewalk? Why do people not adopt existing technologies? So if you look at health, you can talk about how do I manage a healthcare system? But the lowest hanging fruit is, why are people not taking their vaccinations? Why are people not taking their ORS? These things that are incredibly inexpensive, incredibly high returns, and that's kind of free money that you're leaving behind. And so that's kind of created a lot of growing interest in behavioral development economics and behavioral economics, and particularly I think health-seeking behaviors has been a very, very active attractive area for, behavioral economics to come in. So in terms of my own journey in health, there's the public finance piece, there's the development piece, and then there's the service delivery piece, right? Which is kind of how my first research project in this area was what I did in 2003 in this nationwide study of both teacher and doctor absence, right? It means it was a study on public service delivery. And so I also got into health, partly thinking about how do you kind of design public delivery systems across both health and education. Now, so that's in terms of the pieces of the puzzle which I have direct research experience in. But then there's many other parts of the puzzle, right? I mean, where we can talk about, again, in the interest of just exciting your listeners about this as an area of study, right? Of future study. We can talk about health in kind of of labor economics, of economics of innovation, economics of regulation, market failures, market structure, industrial organization. There's health everywhere. Okay. So I can take a quick pause here and then I'll come. But I do want to give your listeners maybe one or two really exciting papers in each of these subfields to give you a sense of, just how much fun people are having in kind of research and how much good stuff there is to be done.
So I'll ask you for those papers, and by the way, the show notes will contain enormous amounts of masala, so kindly do check out the show notes after the show, not during it, because just concentrate. And, I loved your line, you can't eat GDP. So if some listener of the show would like to make t-shirts out of that or whatever, feel free to do so. Maybe you can put Karthik's face on it.
Yeah, I think the show is, I think the meme from last show, I mean, if there's one thing which maybe I would like a little bit of copyright to, is this line on consultants having confidence and academics having confidence intervals. I think enough people like that, so maybe
that's a remarkable line. That's a classic t-shirt line, and now you can't eat GDP is like an incredible line. I'll just quickly go over a couple
Sorry,
of
and coming back to popular culture, right? Like, in Godfather, right? It's like throw the gun, keep the cannoli, right? Like, so it's the food that you keep in a crisis.
Wonderful. Yeah. So I'll quickly go over a couple of the concepts you mentioned, thinking aloud. You can tell me if I'm stating it correctly or not. First of all, Karthik mentioned the term poverty trap. And the classic example of a health poverty trap is, let's say that you are poor. Because you are poor, you are malnourished and you are stunted, right? And because you're malnourished and stunted and you're not getting enough nutrition, you don't have the kind of cognitive development you would otherwise have. You don't have the kind of energy you would otherwise have to do stuff. And therefore you stay poor because you can't work, you can't get ahead. And it becomes a vicious cycle you can't get out of. Now, there is tremendous value to society in getting you out of this vicious cycle. And that is because of, my mind goes back to this term that the economist Julian Simon once used. He wrote a book called The Ultimate Resource, where he spoke to the human being as the ultimate resource. And this again argues against this, false Indian notion of our population being a problem. Simon's point was our population is our greatest strength. All the things that we ascribe to overpopulation are actually issues of bad governance. That every individual has a potential to give more to the world than she takes out. But for that, you have to cross a minimum level of subsistence where you can actually do that. If you're caught in a poverty trap of any kind, such as this health-based vicious circle where you just can't get out of it, then you can't reach your true potential. And if you reach your true potential, it helps everybody. It's like a positive externality. So in that sense, the trade-off between redistribution and growth doesn't come into the picture, because this kind of redistribution actually aids in growth, because people are reaching their potential and helping everybody else also as they do that, because it's a positive sum game. We all sort of grow together. Now we can get to the papers that you'd like to recommend.
And that's exactly right. And in fact, let me take a slight tangent. So let me pose a quiz to you. Okay. So the definition of the poverty line in India. Okay. So the definition back in the day used to be, do you have the income needed to consume a minimum amount of calories? Okay, so that's it. It was just the minimum caloric content of, say, 2,000 calories a day. Okay, now, so the question I have for you, this is the puzzle, is when you have a poverty rate at independence of over 50% or 60%, or even now of, say, 20%, that means by definition, these are people who are earning less than the minimum amount of calories needed to survive, right? So the question is, how do people survive? If the definition is the minimum amount of food needed to survive, is then how do you survive below the poverty line?
That's a good puzzle. I mean, one could just argue that you're not surviving as a human should, that you're being forced by circumstances to operate on a level below what a human can operate at.
So you're starting to get warm, right? Because, people will often say, okay, maybe they're getting transfers from others and stuff like that. And even that doesn't fully work, because the NSS measures based on consumption and not income, okay? And it also includes home production, so the food you produce. But the answer is broadly what you alluded to, right? Which is the caloric minimum is the caloric minimum for a person with a healthy BMI, right? But what the body does when you don't have that nutritional inputs early on is you just don't grow to potential, right? And so by reducing the size of the body, you reduce kind of the caloric needs needed to maintain it. But that comes at enormous long-term cost in terms of both the cognitive development as well as, other aspects of higher likelihood of physical morbidity, right? And so, yeah, we'll talk about nutrition if we have time in a way, because that's slightly different from health care. But, in some ways, I would say that's almost one of the most important kind of health investments we need to make. So yeah, I think, just stepping back about health economics as a field more broadly is not just in terms of papers, right? But just to give your listeners a sense of, and again, building off on some of the things Ajay talked about, what makes health one of the most vexing areas of kind of economics and of policy, is it goes back to the fact that your basic market accountability mechanisms often break down, right? And Ken Arrow, who's one of the most brilliant economists of the 20th century, I think has this famous paper where he says, the laissez-faire solution for healthcare is terrible, okay? And that's essentially because you're in a situation of what's called a credence good, where you don't know what you need, and the doctor has to both tell you what you need and prescribe. So there's all of these asymmetries of information. There is the fact that comparison shopping doesn't work when you've had an accident and you're looking for a hospital. You don't go there and bargain and saying what the price of your life-saving treatment should be. And so which means your standard market metaphors break down. Okay, so and then pricing. Okay, so pricing in any market is, as we know, it can sit anywhere between cost and value, right? So there's this huge wedge. But if you're in a moment of very inelastic demand, right, the ability to charge essentially your last living penny, right, is very, very high, right? So there are a whole bunch of reasons for why unbridled market kind of, conditions don't work, which again makes this a very, very, very active area of thinking about what would be the right kind of policy frameworks to allow you to mitigate some of this, because there are problems with everything. That's, I think, the really hard part about health, right? So, which is why I wouldn't even pretend to say we have solutions. So, in fact, I'm reminded of my first PhD lecture I attended in macroeconomics, right? So, this is by Greg Mankiw, who I think, later went on to be CEA to the president. And he started his lecture by saying, macro is a difficult subject. He said, you are confused and I'm confused, okay? The only difference is you are naively confused and I'm profoundly confused. So my goal, perhaps at the end of just the discussion on health, is to make people profoundly confused, okay, so that you're at least asking the right questions. But coming back to, other areas of what makes health economics both so interesting and so vexing, is let's think about the economics of innovation, all right? And you're seeing this battle play out right now, which is what kind of patenting regime should you have, right, to both serve as an incentive for the people who are innovating. But then conditional on having the innovation, it is massive deadweight loss to then charge these high prices, because the marginal cost is obviously very, very low, right? So how do you kind of both set up structures to get the innovation and conditional on the innovation make that access, to everybody, right? And I can give you an example of specific solutions, right? That are worth thinking about. Then you can think about the economics of regulation. So I have a student today, who will be presenting in our lunch workshop in about 4 hours on asking about, is the FDA too conservative in its regulatory protocols? Because there's this trade-off of type 1 and type 2 error, right? And so because bureaucrats tend to be risk averse, that one adverse event is much more costly than the potential cost of not allowing a positive drug to enter the market, because people don't see that. So, he's got some very nice evidence now in the context of a certain class of therapeutics to then show that it looks like they may be getting too conservative. And then he's got another paper looking at, regulation versus litigation as a way of enforcing good behavior. So again, these are just huge areas of research. In fact, coming to economics of innovation, there's a very nice paper, and these are tangents, but I think it's fun to think about. So one of the big misallocation of public expenditure, in my view, okay, say in the US, is that how much more money we spend on end-of-life care in the last year of life, okay, compared to how little we spend on, say, early childhood care, right? When you have an entire life of 80 years to get the returns to that investment, okay? Now, for the longest time, I used to think that there's a very simple political economy explanation for this, right? Which is that children don't vote, okay? Whereas your retirees are incredibly like a reliable voting bloc. And so the American Association of Retired Persons is an incredibly powerful political lobby. And so, by construction, You've created political incentives, right? I mean, to spend much more in the ending phase of life, like, than for young children, though as a society, you would benefit much, much more from those early life investments, okay? But it turns out that there's this very, very nice paper that is asking this question about why do we have so much more medical innovation in end of life care, okay, than medical innovations that say at the life of 20 or 30, that if you got this new medication or new drug would dramatically improve your life for 60 years, okay? But we still get much more innovation on end of life drugs. So why do you think this might be happening?
Because the end of life people would be a more powerful lobby.
Okay, so that was my initial hypothesis, and that is certainly part of the story. But it turns out that there's a much more basic scientific explanation that has nothing to do with the incentives in terms of the political incentives of lobbying. So let's think more.
Well, there is also the seen and the unseen, in the sense that if you create, say, drugs at 20, which make me, live 10 years more at the end of my life, the effects are unseen. Whereas if you create something which will make someone who's 79 go to 80, the effects are more seen.
So you're starting to get very, very warm, okay? And so again, this I'm very impressed because I didn't give you any hint that I was going to talk about this or this paper, okay? But yes, so the basic point is this, right? That if you look at any clinical trials have to designate what they call an endpoint and saying what is the outcome we are looking at, right? So one of the reasons these different vaccine trials are not strictly comparable is that the designated endpoint was different, right? So for some of them, that the outcome they were looking at was symptomatic cases, others they were looking at hospitalizations. But if you think about a pharmaceutical company that's coming up with a new drug, right? The holy grail of efficacy of your drug is if you can show impact on mortality, okay? If you can show that this had an impact on increasing life expectancy by even 3 months, you're golden, because the value of a statistical life is kind of several hundreds of thousands of dollars. And if you show that I extend this by 3 months, then you have the ability to price accordingly, okay? But here's the point. If I have an intervention at age 20 that's going to increase your life expectancy, I have to wait 60 years, for the study to be completed, because essentially people, you're not dying at the same rate, okay? But if you have a universe of 85-year-olds in your study, you will reach your endpoint in your study within 5 years. So ironically, one of the reasons the vaccine trials got done much faster with Pfizer and Moderna was because the case rates were exploding. So which meant that the endpoint was being reached faster in the control group relative to the treatment group. So it's an example of how subtle, and this is a lovely paper by Eric Budish at Chicago and Heidi Williams, who used to be at MIT and is now at Stanford. So, and it kind of discusses these time horizon aspects of what determines incentives for innovation. But the reason I'm mentioning this is that, as you've said in previous podcasts, one of the great miracles, despite the pains of this pandemic, has been how science has kind of stepped up to the field. But the point is, what are the institutional incentive structures for science, right? I mean, what determines research? What determines what gets researched? What determines what gets funded? So all of those are also questions where economists can come in, and think about the incentives, because essentially economists, I would say there's 3 core concepts, right? One is scarce resources, how do you kind of optimize and maximize value for money? Second is incentives, right? Anytime something doesn't make sense, you unpeel the onion and saying, okay, why are these incentives of the individual agents not aligned with the macro good? And then the third is, empirics and data and causal analysis and causal inference, which is the problem, particularly in things like health, is theoretically I can argue any issue both left and right, okay? So, and which is why I think the empirical turn of economics in the past 20 years or 30 years has been such a good thing, because we're now able to take a lot more of this abstract theorizing and come down to brass tacks and saying, okay, now let's look at the actual data and saying which side do these trade-offs go off, okay? So, and that's kind of why economics in any policy area, right? I mean, in fact, Marty Feldstein, in my last few years before he retired, was trying to create a whole new field of the economics of national security, okay? So, and even bigger black box of public funding is what we spend on defense, okay? So one very, very, very simple metric of how little accountability there is or efficiency there is in defense spending is if you look at the budget share of the Army, Navy, and Air Force in the US, okay? This has basically, for the most part, been unchanged since World War II. Okay, and it is impossible to believe that the marginal product of your offensive capacity has stayed the same across these kind of land, air, and navy. But no, the budgets will go lockstep because it has to be proportional to keep the balance between the powers and the forces, right? So in education and health, economists have started doing a lot more in terms of analyzing and understanding the outcomes. For something like defense, it's obviously much, much harder. But I would conjecture that there is such an incredible amount of waste and inefficiency, in how we spend inside the black box of kind of defense ministries, that it is ripe for kind of, more value for money type analysis. But this is just a way of saying why economics is and should be everywhere. Now, of course, sometimes the field gets a little bit of a bad rep because it can be imperialistic, it can be a little hubristic. But I think these three core principles of economics apply to almost any area of policy, which is resources are scarce, and so there's opportunity costs, and how do you maximize value for money? Second is incentives matter. And third, let's look at the data, look at the empirics, look at causal inference, and then try to, optimize given all of these constraints we have.
Fantastic. And this is also why economics is so fascinating, that it's a lens through which you can look at all of life and every little bit of the world, and it's incredible. Now, you've said so many things and I have so many asides to make, which I have been noting down, that I will quickly go through the asides. And now we will go back to that prehistoric time almost 20 minutes ago when you were talking about nutrition. And my aside there about how the body adapts to the nutrition it's getting is that I remember I made an observation in the 1990s, which when I first made it, I thought, wait a minute, it's just today, it can't be right. And then I saw it again, and then I was like, oh shit. And the observation was, when I came to Bombay in the 90s, mid-90s, I used to commute by local train. And in local trains, I noticed that the people in first class were taller than the people in second class. Always, without exception. The first day I noticed that, like, whatever. And then you notice it again, and then you notice it again. And the difference at that time was actually stark. And it's almost like the visibility of luck, because it's basically your luck, where people have ended up, and it's almost as if it's visible. You can see it. You don't need to theorize about it. The other aspect which you pointed out, and you cited Arrow saying laissez-faire doesn't work in healthcare for all those excellent reasons you gave, asymmetry of information and all of that. And at the same time, it is such a vexed subject that in one of your papers you actually demonstrate why it doesn't apply to India. So we're going to talk more about that as we go along. Then you spoke about your student who's giving a presentation on the FDA, and I'm quickly going to make a book recommendation for my readers, which is a book called Fortress and Frontier in American Healthcare by a dude called Robert Grabois, who in fact won the Bastiat Prize in 2014, the year before I got it for the second time. An excellent book which kind of conceptually, if you read the book and the concepts of the fortress and the frontier as one way to think about it were sort of quite eye-opening for me. And I would agree with whatever your student is about to say in his presentation, in the sense that I think the FDA is way too conservative, and the lives that could have been saved had they not been conservative are what is the unseen. But that is a subject for another episode. And then you spoke about, the whole patent and intellectual property debate. And we won't get into that, but what I will put in the show notes and recommend that my readers check out is Alex Tabarrok, who's a frequent guest on the show, wrote a post recently about why patents are not a constraint in this current situation. And I absolutely agree. They are not a constraint. It's just, in Alex's words, virtue signaling for a certain sort of people. They don't solve a problem. But at the same time, what I'd like to also point my readers to is something called the Tabarrok curve, which is about 8 years ago. Alex showed this beautiful curve which demonstrated his point of that even though patents are necessary, if you make them too strong, too stringent, they actually affect innovation, and innovation goes down. And Alex's point is that they are too stringent and they are a problem, and he demonstrates this with a beautiful graph. And this is where I love the elegance of economics and math and all of that. So I'll put up all of those links. Let's go back now and talk about, at the level of concept, I'm going to ask you to get a little meta here, and here I'm sure at some level it mirrors your intellectual journey of understanding healthcare as well. And my broad question is this, that how should we think of healthcare? Like, in the sense, if you imagine India when it becomes independent, and in one of the papers you gave, there was a startling figure that our life expectancy in 1961 was something like 41 years old, which means we'd both be dead by now. So we've clearly come a long way. Now, in that poverty-stricken state that we were in then, at that design stage, how should we think about healthcare? How did we think about healthcare? What did we get wrong? And who got it right? What is a model to follow? Because everybody's poor. There's no market as such. And yet, so it's, in a sense, it's the state's responsibility. Everybody benefits. How should one think about healthcare? And in your own journey, what were the priors you started with? That this is how healthcare should be organized? And how did those priors changed over time as you got deeper and deeper into the field?
The good news is, like Sherlock Holmes famously said, right? It's a capital mistake to theorize without data, right? So I don't even think I came in with very strong priors, right? I started my journey in this field just by wanting to figure out what's going on, right? So going back to that dirty shoes kind of analogy, right? Just like I was doing the work in education, I was also visiting PHCs around the country, as part of that original field work we did for that absence study and just kind of seeing the state of the land. So I've had less priors in this. So there's two separate questions, okay? One is, let me talk a little bit about my journey in healthcare research in India and the things that I know from my own work, as well as, people like Jishnu in particular and Jeff Hammer have done a lot more work, in fact, in this area. So I'll draw a fair bit on their work. And of course, a lot of others too. But these are kind of, the economists who I feel are thinking about these systemic incentives, design challenges in the right way. So taking a step back to the origins of the Indian healthcare system. So there was this committee called the Bhore Committee. Okay, so the Bhore Committee was set up in 1943. And this was a Maharashtrian gentleman who was in the ICS and, I think had held multiple senior positions. And the Bhore Committee took about 2 years to submit its report on the structure of healthcare. 1946 is when they submitted the report. And, a lot of this follows what I would call as a broad WHO template for the building of health systems in developing countries. And the general sense is that the market doesn't work for a variety of reasons. Market doesn't work not just in terms of the asymmetric information, but also simply in terms of locating providers in remote areas or rural areas, right? That people don't want to be in those places. And so unless the government comes actively and builds out a network of clinics and staffs them with public doctors and nurses, there is no way you're going to get healthcare into, remote areas, okay? And this kind of structure follows a very well-established template of saying that you will have, a sub-center. So there are district hospitals, community health centers, primary health centers, sub-centers, okay? So you're supposed to have a sub-center for about 5,000 population, a primary health center for about 25,000. So sub-center is supposed to be staffed with a nurse, one male multi-purpose worker, and they are supposed to be like the first line of primary care in a village. The primary health center serves about 20 to 30,000 and is supposed to have at least one fully qualified doctor, right? One MBBS doctor, and has oversight over these sub-centers. And then you're supposed to have the community health center that caters to about 100 to 120,000 with a larger number of beds, more specialty doctors. And then you've got the district hospital that's supposed to be like your primary point of care in the district. Okay, so on paper, this is a perfectly sensible structure, right? I don't think it was different from kind of the structures envisaged for many countries, right? But the larger problem over time has been one that, and I don't think this is unique to health, right? I think the fundamental problem for India, and this is again something I discuss in the book in some detail, because again, historical political economy is a massive field. In fact, there's a new handbook coming out of like 52 chapters, okay? So I'm trying to synthesize that entire literature in like half a chapter, one section or one chapter, right? But I think one important piece of perspective to have is that when you say that people are poor, therefore the government has to do it, that's not obvious, because when the people are poor, the government is also poor. Okay, so because the government is nothing but the sum of the people, right? And what is your tax base? Okay, so when people are poor, in fact, the government has less ability. So coming back to state capacity, and that's because the tax to GDP ratio usually increases as you get richer. Okay, and that's because as people are super poor, like you can't even morally tax them, okay? Because you need the basics you have just to survive. And institutionally, it's much, much harder to tax informal workers. And so, the formalization of the workforce is then very strongly correlated with the rising of a tax GDP ratio, okay? So I think the first slight nuance in what you said is when the people are poor, doesn't automatically mean the government can do something, because the government is also poor. And in fact, relatively, the government is more poor when the people are poor, you see, because the tax to GDP ratio is lower in a poorer country, okay? So that's, I think, a first very important point, for listeners to understand, because, it is just so natural. You go out to rural India, you just see kind of how abysmal the conditions of, say, health facilities are. And it's just very, very normal and natural to come back and say, oh, the government should do this, okay? And I think the single most important problem, what we don't if you want to make sense of why the Indian state seems to flounder at everything, the simple answer is we're trying to do too much. Okay, and if you go look at the long arc of the state over a 500-year period, right? I mean, so I characterize the evolution of the state into what three broad phases. Okay, there is what I call the security state, right, which is the primary goal of initial states was national security, right? I mean, save your borders and do law and order, and because the biggest existential threat was you were going to be run over and enslaved and slaughtered. Okay, so and one simple way of seeing this is that in ancient states, even medieval Europe, you were spending somewhere from 70 to 80% of the public budget on defense. 70 to 80%. Okay, like of money was essentially going on defense, right? So then it's in the 18th and 19th century that you kind of get the second phase of the state, of what I call the industrial state or the developmental state, where for the first time now the state realizes that, hey, let me take tax revenue and build public goods and build public infrastructure, whether it's roads or railways or ports or public sewage systems, and that these are things that will dramatically increase productivity. And so the return on investment on these public investments is way, way, way higher, okay, than simply going and fighting wars. I still need a military so that I'm not taken over, but my ROI in terms of growing my productive capacity is now going to be higher than going and taking over somebody else, okay? And it's not like the older states didn't build roads, right? But the Industrial Revolution dramatically increases the complementarity with the physical infrastructure, because now you have at scale production. And so then the investments in the logistics and the transport and the storage and all of that starts paying off, like, once the scale of production starts going up. Okay. So, and it is that period of the industrial state and massive investments in public goods that is associated then with the escape from the Malthusian trap, right? Where for the first time you start seeing this massive increase in GDP per capita. Because till then, the 3,000-year history of humanity is essentially GDP per capita stayed mostly flat, right? So because productivity went up, but population also went up. So coming back to your old point about are human beings, are you brains or are you stomachs, right? I mean, I think is how you had, classified it. And the Malthusian view is that humans are stomachs, and therefore, there is this trap and you need to reduce population. Whereas the Romer view, which is what he won his Nobel Prize for, and it's also in Kramer's famous 93 O-ring paper, right? Is that people are brains. And if the innovation is a function of the right tail of your distribution, then having more people automatically means you'll be more innovative. But that requires a certain minimum kind of capacity of the brain. And so it is related because the demographic transition, where you move from high fertility, high mortality to low fertility, low mortality, is very, very important in giving parents the resources to invest in the human capital of the children, right? So in that sense, it's a bit more subtle, right? That you can't just say, I will expand the population and get the innovation if that expansion is coming at the cost of being able to invest in the human capital, right? So, but anyway, but coming back to the state itself, so you get this massive increase in GDP per capita, both because you're increasing the numerator from the Industrial Revolution and because you're reducing the denominator, through the demographic transition, and investing in the human capital, right? I mean, and so that's why that all those three pieces go together, right? In terms of, because GDP per capita is about making people more productive, and people get more productive and they have more human capital, right? So that is this big transition that happens in kind of the 19th century, mainly in the Western states, right? I mean, but I think the important point we need to understand is that the modern welfare state, right, has only been in existence for less than 100 years, okay? So if you look at the data on kind of the fraction of GDP that is spent on welfare programs, okay, so whether it's food assistance, healthcare, unemployment insurance, old age insurance, all of these major welfare programs have only showed up in the world in the last 70, 80 years, right, after the Great Depression and particularly after World War II, okay? So which means that, again, I think informally, Arvind Subramaniam and I have talked about this, others have talked about this, but we are just putting a lot of data in the book and documenting this in a comparative way and then showing that, listen, a bulk of this explosion in the welfare state that we kind of now expect that a state should do really happens only after today's Western countries reach a middle income status, right? So a simple example of, say, food security is that the US launches food stamps at a GDP per capita of $8,000 PPP, okay, which is when you're trying to do food security. India does PDS at a GDP per capita of $800, okay, at 1/10 of that GDP per capita. So now, so at one level, this is a great moral triumph, okay? So, and then the other important point to realize is that these three phases of the state are also very strongly correlated with the amount of democracy you have, okay? So the security state is essentially associated even today with non-democratic regimes, right? You go to Pyongyang, that's your modern security state, or you go to, so in that sense, that serves the interests of just the pure ruling class. Now, what is subtle and underappreciated about this phase of the industrial state, okay, is that it is not just that people decided to do this. It reflected a political arrangement of expanded but not universal franchise, right? So the extent of the vote in that period is, you're still restricting the vote to the propertied elite, to the educated elite, right? So yes, it's more than kings and nobles. So maybe 20-25% have the vote, but no women, no minorities, right? And so what that means is that, so over time, infrastructure investments are going to benefit everyone, right? It benefits the poor through integrating markets and reducing prices, okay? But in the short term, the returns to those infrastructure investments are mainly going to be capitalized by the property owners in the first place, right? Because the property price. So, which means that is the class that then has an incentive to invest in those public goods, okay? And it is not a coincidence that the welfare state is strongly correlated with expansion of the franchise, right? So, when you start getting to universal adult democracy, you automatically then create the political pressures for welfare, okay? Now, this is a wonderful thing, okay? So, we have study after study after study that just show, listen, because in a way it's easy to look at this industrial state and saying like, acha, see, they managed to do all of this because of limited democracy. But that's coming at a huge moral cost, right? It's coming at the moral cost of being built on the backs of either slavery domestically in the US or a colonial empire in the case of the British, right? And which is why the democracy before development, which is what makes India so uniquely different, is a great moral triumph, okay? And at no point of this discourse should it be suggested that that was in any way responsible for weaknesses. But like I said, the moral triumph of democracy then increases our aspirations of the claims we make on the state, but we are trying to satisfy those claims at a GDP per capita that's 10 times or 20 times lower than what today's West had when they tried to do their welfare states, right? So essentially, this is a long-winded way of coming back to your starting point of saying that how should we think about healthcare in a world like, when people are poor? It is that much as you may want to do healthcare, right? Like, you often simply don't have the money, right? Because you're starting at such a low base. And so what it does is it raises enormously the premium on cost effectiveness. So it's not that the state should not be doing things. The state needs to do things, right? But the premium on cost effectiveness and hard-headed attention to evidence is even higher when you're trying to do this, right? Off such a low base, okay? So that is more as a matter of kind of framing the context, but I haven't really started answering your question in terms of how should you design healthcare in that setting. But like I said, it's just good to frame that historical context before we start getting into what we should do. And that's relevant even today, right? Because yes, our tax to GDP ratio is now at about 18%, but that's still half of what the OECD is. So, every sector specific activist, education walas want 6% of GDP, health walas want 3% of GDP. Everybody says we just need more money. But boss, you're not allowed to ask me for more money till you tell me what you're cutting. Okay. So which is why a big part of the book is to say that given how much inefficiency we have in public spending today, rather than arguing about increasing the size of the budget and fighting battles with other ministries, if every minister and secretary would turn their attention inwards to say, how do I improve the effectiveness of my existing budget, we will be way, way better off as a country, right? Than fighting the political fights of who gets to control bigger budgets.
So before you get to answering my question, and I loved your aside, long aside, a couple of asides taking off from the aside, which is that, first of all, for someone who is so much into empirics and data, it is obviously the Senian influence that you mentioned the word moral triumph and morally wrong. And, you're using these phrases while sort of chatting about all the things you chatted about. So I'll go to a couple of them. First of all, you spoke about how democracy is a moral triumph, and I agree. But except that I'm not sure the democracy in India is actually a democracy in its fullest sense. Like one of the things that we really did was that we took over the colonial state apparatus. The oppressive state remains the oppressive state. The tax on salt is more than what the British were charging when Gandhi went on the Dandi Salt March. So whereas like the modern day Gandhi, and that leads me to your other use of the word moral when you said that it is morally wrong to tax the poorest, which of course it is, but of course we do tax them in terms of indirect taxes. Even the beggar at the traffic signal will buy salt somewhere, will buy soap, will buy all of those things. Those are taxed. You look at the price of petrol today, where it has gone, completely sort of bizarre. It's equal to theft. And
But by the way,
petrol
sorry,
affects everything.
there I disagree. I think the petrol tax is actually good, but I'll come back in a moment and talk about why. But with a few caveats and how it is used. But all else being equal, given that you need a certain amount of revenue, I still think that's a good tax. But I'll come back to that in a moment. Yeah.
We'll come back to that. I mean, I think because a rising price of petrol affects everything else, and therefore I think that is slightly problematic. And also, what we saw with the Modi government in 2014 is that global oil prices crashed, but our oil prices didn't. They weren't passed on to the consumer. They were kept by the predatory state. And apart from that, obviously, I couldn't agree with you more. I've said it repeatedly so often that it's almost become a cliche of mine that we have a state that doesn't do the things it should do, like rule of law and like what we'll be discussing today, but it does a lot of things that it should not do. And those are not just wastages, like all the areas of rent seeking and building statues and grand buildings for our rulers and all of that, but also in the many different ways that it comes in the way of society solving its own problems. Like one reason, as I think Ajay and I discussed, or Gautam and I discussed, I forget who I discussed it with, but I think everyone would agree that one reason this second wave came so hard is that we didn't have good enough data about how bad the first wave really was. And one of the reasons we didn't have good enough data is the government monopolized testing in the early part of when COVID-19 struck and said only we will test, and it got in the way of private sector solving its problems. And of course, as Ajay and I discussed in our vaccines episode, the government has to do what it has to do, go on a war footing and try to vaccinate people, but also allow private people to get Pfizer, Moderna, J&J, whatever from outside. But not only does it not do the few things it should do properly, it gets in the way of our solving our own problems. But having done with my aside, I will let you talk about the petrol aspect of it, and then you can get to answering the question, which in case you've forgotten, I'll remind you, is how should we think at a meta level of our healthcare system? Like what were the design mistakes we made, and is there someone who got it right in an equivalent condition?
Yeah, so let me save the petrol tax question when I come back and talk about pollution.
Sure.
Okay, and why I think it's a good tax. But coming back to systems of healthcare, I would say the cardinal mistake, right? I mean, and this is not just India. The cardinal mistake is prioritizing curative over preventive public health. Okay, so if you, in a world of scarce resources, if you have to say, I need highest ROI on my limited spending, where am I going to spend that money? It really is in water, right? Air quality. So water quality, air quality are, just these are the ways through which most diseases kind of pass, right? And things like surveillance, right? And prevention. Now, there are some things we've done well. Vaccination is something we've done well. And I'll come back and talk about the micro incentives and why it works well, right? But this problem of prioritizing curative versus preventive is not unique to India, right? I mean, it is the nature of politics. It's the nature of the fact that people, it just responds to the fact that people viscerally, think about health only when you don't have it, right? I mean, so when you're healthy, you don't think about it. You don't do your exercise. In my case, I don't sleep enough. So we all have our own kind of ways in which we underinvest in our health in a preventive way, right? But the moment something goes wrong is when it becomes salient, okay? So that, I think, is, unfortunately, it is, I would say, a government reflecting what people's revealed preference is. Now, ideally, this is where leadership matters, right? Because a good politician gives his voters what they want. A good leader, takes his or her voters to where we should go, right? In the public interest. And so, this is why public health and health policy in particular requires serious scientific expertise and serious economic expertise in terms of cost effectiveness and making the public case and saying this is what we need to be doing. Okay, so I think in terms of the structure, you can't argue with the core of the system that was set up. I think the reason it has weakened so much over time, frankly, again, is it goes back to these resource constraints, right? That you're understaffed and under-equipped, but also the incentive constraints, right? So part of the problem that I was documenting in the absence work is that you have these clinics with about 40% absence rates of doctors and nurses. And again, you can't even necessarily blame the doctors, and I'll come back to that in a second. But I think where the system fails is the system still primarily thinks of itself as a logistics operation and doesn't think about, the incentives and how this plays out in the last mile. Okay, so when we come talk about policy, because I think my broad hope is that, given our 3-hour rough track record, is to use the first hour to just talk principles, the second hour to talk research in India and what we've learned, and the last hour to talk about policy. But, when I come back to policy, I'll talk about both kind of investments we can and should make in terms of public health and also in terms of the curative health system itself. Now, but let me give you an aside and a fun joke, which you'll really like. This problem about prioritizing curative as opposed to fundamental things that give you deeper returns. So you see this in the US, right? Schools of medicine are much, much better funded than schools of public health, okay? So medical school will have like tons of endowed professorships, tons of huge research grants, so much money. Whereas the public health guys are always kind of, scrounging for resources because it's kind of seen as not as urgent, right? So that problem is there even in the US. So one of my apocryphal, I don't know if this is an urban legend, but I've definitely heard this, but I've forgotten who I heard it from, so I can't source this, okay? But there's this wonderful apocryphal story about the director of the National Science Foundation and the director of the National Institute of Health, okay? So these are the two biggest funders of research in the US, and they are both testifying in front of the Senate, okay, making the case for their budget. And so the NSF guy, apparently shows up with like all of these files and like tens of thousands of papers, right? Saying here is all the amazing research that's been produced. Here's the citation count. Here is how much, this research is changing X, Y, Z in all of these sectors, okay? And the NIH guy has like a very, very thin folder. He has one thin folder with just 100 sheets of paper, okay? And this guy has about 10,000. But at the end of these hearings, the NIH guy walks out with a budget that's 10 times the size of the NSF, okay? So with his 100-page binder. So the NSF guy apparently asked him, "Arey boss, how did you do this? Here I have all of this evidence, all of this stuff, and you're walking away with a 10 times bigger budget. What is in that folder of yours?" So he says, "Aha, what I have in these 100 sheets of paper are the personal medical histories of every one of the 100 senators, in this room." So, the point is that we are just much more viscerally connected to things that we have experienced, and ill health is, the need for curative stuff is something we see in the moment of having fallen sick, right? But the need for preventive stuff that has much higher returns is the seen and the unseen, right? So everything almost like my book should have a subtitle seen and unseen for like every chapter, right? And I'll give you some copyright or royalties on the title. But yeah, it underpins everything. But therefore, I think it's easy to kind of blame the leadership, but in a way it reflects what the population wants, right? The population wants tertiary care in a way more than primary care. So part of the point of a moment like this is for scientific leadership and kind of economic policy leadership to explain to the political leadership and teach them how to explain to the people, right? That this is what we need as a country and why we need to do this, right? But yeah, so that's what we need to do.
Yeah, firstly, the seen and the unseen, you should, give the credit to Frederick Bastiat, because obviously the title is taken from his famous essay, That Which Is Seen and That Which Is Not Seen, though that appears to me to be a clumsy English translation of whatever the French original title was. A couple of asides, and one is an anecdote, and it's almost a circular anecdote, because you sent me a paper by Das and Hammer, from which I posted an anecdote on Twitter, which I'll repeat later when we get to kind of that section of this episode. But in response to that, there is this excellent doctor in Mumbai called Lancelot Pinto, and he shared this anecdote. He gets asthma patients all the time who come to him when they have an asthma attack and they want medicine for it and all of that. And each time he tells them that, "Hey, I gave you an inhaler for preventive use. Why don't you use that?" But they don't care about preventive. It's almost like there's an illusion of eternal good health and immortality until disease strikes you or something strikes you don't care, and then you want it to be cured. And this sort of brings one to the question of incentives. Again, in the sense that, look, for a politician, why should he invest in preventive care or public health, when the results of that are not seen, and will be seen like way beyond whatever the election cycle is. And one answer as to how those incentives would be different is, I'm just thinking aloud because you were mentioning pollution earlier. And if you sort of think about the history of London is an excellent city to live in today in terms of livability. But at the turn of the 19th century, it was a hellhole. It was way more polluted than it is today, right? At the turn of the 20th century, rather, way more polluted than it is today. But what typically happens and has happened in all the great Western cities is that once people reach a certain level of wealth and empowerment, they demand better governance, they demand better air, and then the state has no option but to give it to them. But I would imagine, and I'm thinking aloud, that the condition which makes that possible is that there is empowered local government where it can actually happen, and that's not really the case in India. Again, I mean, I know these are all old laments, and we will no doubt discuss this in your episode on
I will point
federalism.
it to the episode on federalism.
Yeah, we'll talk about it in the episode to federalism. So great point. So now is the time to kind of get into the research part of the episode and into the nitty-gritties. But before that, let's take a quick commercial break. Long before I was a podcaster, I was a writer. In fact, chances are that many of you first heard of me because of my blog India Uncut, which was active between 2003 and 2009 and became somewhat popular at the time. I loved the freedom the form gave me, and I feel I was shaped by it in many ways. I exercised my writing muscle every day and was forced to think about many different things because I wrote about many different things. Well, that phase in my life ended for various reasons, and now it is time to revive it. Only now I'm doing it through a newsletter. I have started the India Uncut newsletter at indiauncut.substack.com, where I will write regularly about whatever catches my fancy. I'll write about some of the themes I cover in this podcast and about much else. So please do head on over to indiauncut.substack.com and subscribe. It is free. Once you sign up, each new installment that I write will land up in your email inbox. You don't need to go anywhere. So subscribe now for free. The India Uncut newsletter at indiauncut.substack.com. Thank you. Welcome back to The Scene and the Unseen. I'm chatting with Kartik Muralidharan on the state of Indian healthcare. Like, let's understand the problem before we begin thinking about solving it, because right now it seems almost unsolvable. But understanding the problem is good enough. And at least we'll have profound confusion instead of naive confusion, as Greg Mankiw once told Kartik. So Kartik, let's get down to the nitty-gritties. One of the sort of delightful thing, and you sent me a bunch of papers which I'll link from the show notes, and one of the delightful things about them was that, one, they were full of data, so they confirmed a lot of my intuitions, and two, a lot of the data also felt counterintuitive at times, and gave me a more nuanced understanding just by virtue of being what they are, just the figures themselves, without any interpretation necessarily. And I found it fascinating. And in the chapter in your book, in fact, you've structured it very well, where you begin talking about outcomes. So I'll ask you about our healthcare system. You've spoken about different metrics like infant mortality, life expectancy, stunting and malnutrition, and so on, by which we can get a sense of how far we have come. And the point is, it's a mixed picture. We've come quite far, but we should have been much further along. So tell me a little bit about sort of what these measures are and which ones of them were sort of revelatory to you, or spoke a lot, or surprised you.
Mm-hmm. One of the points I wanted to come back to is, remember the thing I said, which you said should be on a t-shirt, you can't eat GDP. Now, that's not fully right, because you can eat GDP, right? You can use the GDP to buy food, to buy like better medicines, buy a bunch of things, right? So I think, and we'll see here, that GDP really does matter, okay? So that systematically countries and states with higher incomes will have better health outcomes, right? The point is more to say that GDP is not an end in itself, and, it's what it allows you to do. So with that little caveat,
Quick aside there. This is a modification on the T-shirt for fat people like me. On the back, the T-shirt should say you can't eat GDP, but on the front where the paunch is, it should say you can eat GDP. Sorry, continue.
So I think so like I've done in the book with or the draft of the book chapter I've sent you, is that if you want to assess a health system overall, you want to kind of pick a few key indicators that speaks to the larger status of your population health. So life expectancy is usually a good statement of population health overall, right? And infant mortality is a good measure of your health system. And the reason I say that is that infant mortality is something that for the most part we know what to do about, okay? For the most part, the biggest causes, whether it's diarrhea or whether it's diseases that you can address with vaccinations or hospital with very targeted, institutional deliveries, neonatal health. So we kind of know what to do. And so, which is why it's a good measure of your health systems, because you're not at the frontier of your ignorance. You are well within kind of your knowledge frontier, and you just have to learn how to do it. Okay. So that's why infant mortality is like a good measure of your health systems. But life expectancy is a good measure of your population health. Now, there is an important modification to this, which the WHO uses, called the HALE, which is the health adjusted life expectancy, right? So you can have a long life, but have a lower quality of life, particularly because of things like pollution, where, you're just having higher morbidity, even though you may kind of continue to live. So that's, I think, an important additional metric to look at. And then I think the other really important metric of future population health is child malnutrition. Okay, so the mortality is, can I keep the children alive? But if you keep them alive, so in a way, in a perverse way, actually, reducing child mortality can worsen child malnutrition. And that's because you're keeping the left tail of the distribution alive, right? That may otherwise have passed away. So, so the first step is to make sure children stay alive. The second part is to then make sure that by age 2 or by age 5, which are kind of these key particularly age 2, right? I mean, these first 1,000 days of life, as they call them, the 9 months in utero and the first 2 years of life are kind of the critical developmental period where you kind of want to make sure that the children are getting these right inputs in terms of, cognitive developments and brain development and other overall physiological development. So that would be another key metric to look at. Okay. So I think the glass half full story, as with most things in India, is that we've actually made remarkable progress on many of these indications in the last 40, 50 years, right? So in particular, life expectancy has gone up, infant mortality has gone down. Almost every metric has improved. But the question is, like they say in the old grading of students, my teacher, most of the time, if you get 100, great. For anything else, it'll be can do better, right? So, and so, I think the overall grade for India, right, is can do better. Now, but before we get sanguine, right, we can also get much worse, okay? So we can also do much worse. And sometimes I think there's a little bit of a naive push to criticize everything we've done as a country, and that's also incorrect, right? We have done a bunch of things that are correct, and that we are laboring under monumental other institutional weaknesses, which we can talk about. So overall, my net assessment of India over 75 years is that on most metrics, I think we have a lot to be proud of. We really do. At the time of independence, nobody predicted we'd stay united or kind of stay mostly democratic. So there are basic kind of successes that we've had as a state. And even on development outcomes, I think we've actually not done badly. Okay. The question is, what should our benchmarks be? Okay. And now, unlike, say, people in education who go and study education systems in Finland or Singapore, and that kind of really irritates the hell out of me, because I'm you're going and studying places with 20 times the per capita income. But I think if you think about what would be 3 relevant comparisons for India, okay, 3 countries I think we need to benchmark ourselves against would be China, Vietnam, and Bangladesh, okay? And China, because it's the only other large country of similar population in terms of just the sheer size of what they're trying to manage. Vietnam, because it has similar per capita income as India, but does much, much better on health, education, and other social indicators. And Bangladesh, because they had the same initial conditions as us, right? And in many ways were actually worse than India in 71, because the devastation of the war kind of kept them at a lower place. But Bangladesh has now steadily improved and is now far ahead of Bengal and even ahead of all India averages, on a bunch of human development measures. Okay, so again, these are the 3 benchmarks I want us to look at when we are trying to make a sense of can do better. So it is not I'm taking a student and saying, aapko 100% lana hai. Nahin, I'm saying look at these 3 other comparable students who are comparable in their own way and saying, how can you get slightly better? Okay. Then the other big part about health in India that's worth reflecting on is just how much variation there is within the country, right? So, we have this paper, which I'll talk about, but the title of that paper is 2 Indias, okay? It's 2 Indias in the sense that the quality of healthcare that you have in the southern states, particularly Tamil Nadu, Kerala, right? And there are some other states too, is essentially a couple of standard deviations above, what you would get in the north. So I'll talk a little bit more about this measurement paper later. But for example, we find that, even unqualified providers and nurses in Tamil Nadu and Kerala do better than fully trained doctors in UP and Bihar. Okay, so that's a separate, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But, there's obviously a lot to learn from the within country variation, right? And what did some of these states do right? The way I like to think about health systems is what I've done in the book is to just have a set of graphs graphs where I put outcomes graphed against GDP per capita, right? So, because in general, more income allows you to buy more health. It means your parents are richer, the system is richer, everything's richer. So, I expect outcomes to improve with income. But the real lesson comes from looking at which are the states that are positive outliers conditional on income, right? So holding your income constant, which are the states that are doing much better. So to give you a simple example of how that flips results around, in absolute levels, outcomes in Bihar look worse than Haryana, okay? But Haryana is actually much richer than Bihar. And so if you kind of control for GDP and look at health outcomes, actually Bihar ends up doing slightly better than expected for its very, very low GDP. And Haryana ends up doing much worse, okay? Now, but then that starts getting not just into policy issues, but also into social and cultural issues, into empowerment of women in particular. So in fact, ironically, it turns out that women in Bihar end up being much more empowered, partly because there are so many more migrant workers who leave the state, right? I mean, and so which means that the women are running the show, like, much more than they are in some of the other states, because essentially the men are migrating and gone out. So there are some indirect positive gender spillovers, like, that you see in Bihar as a result of the structure of the economy. But I think the larger point when we think about how do we get better as a country is to say that we've done well, we have a lot to be proud of. And I'll talk about the specific pieces of the system that have worked well, but we can obviously do better. Okay. And then, that's how I frame that whole discussion. Yeah, so that's kind of overall health, right? But we can then start looking at the healthcare system itself in terms of the structure of the healthcare system. What does it look like? I mean, is there stuff I'll pause for a second before I start talking about that.
What I'll do is everything that you said, I'll fill in some figures which I've got from papers partly written by you and from the chapter in your book itself, because I found them very illustrative. Like, one, what is the glass half full? The glass half full is that infant mortality in India has declined from 142.6 per 1,000 live births in 1970 to 28.3 in 2019. And you'd think 28.3 is good, but it's still 4 times more kids dying here than in China, which is 6.3. Vietnam is 15.9. Even Bangladesh is, less kids die, 25.6. Again, you talk about how life expectancy and at birth was, 41.4 in 1960, which is mind-blowing. If we were like the median person, we'd be dead if we were in 1960. And it's gone to 69.4 today. But the point that you made about health-adjusted life expectancy was that India's health-adjusted life expectancy, what are the healthy years of your life that you can expect? That's 59.3. So there are 10 years of this 69.4 which you're losing to ill health, and you're nowhere near full potential. Again, this number is, worse than China, Vietnam, or Bangladesh. And you give various reasons for this. Similarly, you talk about sort of stunting, where I'll quote from your book, quote, India has reduced the fraction of stunted children under 5 from a shockingly high 62.7% in 1989 to 34.7% in 2017, stop quote, which is also shockingly high. And as you point out, quote, India's stunting rate is 4.3 times greater than that in China. 34.7 versus 8.1, 46% greater than Vietnam, even 13% greater than Bangladesh, which are, the glass half empty, therefore does seem to be quite empty. Then you pointed, figures that reflect the variation that you gave within India. You point out how infant mortality rates in states like MP is 47, Odisha is 44, Assam is 44, UP is 43, and you have Goa, which is 8. Kerala, which is 10, Puducherry, which is 10, Tamil Nadu is 17, Maharashtra is 19. The figures kind of speak for themselves. And about those outliers also, I found that fascinating how, in absolute terms, Bihar seems to be worse than Haryana, but when you adjust for per capita income, it's actually much better. And you gave the Bihar side of the reason that so many migrants are there, so women are running the show. I'll again give a brief aside. I once wrote a feature story on Sakshi Malik after she won the bronze medal at the Olympics. I think she won bronze, right? One of the things I was trying to investigate during that is how the hell does a state which is known for its misogyny, in other words Haryana, and the way it treats its women, how the hell are they getting so many female wrestlers and all of that? And the answer actually does lie in patriarchy, where in the 1970s there was this dude who was a wrestling coach called Chandgi Ram, and Chandgi Ram didn't have sons. And in 77 or 78, the Olympic Committee announced that that they'd have a women's category in wrestling. So he made his daughter, I think Sonika Kalikaraman, her name was.
This is the Dangal story.
He's the Dangal coach Mahavir Singh Fogart was Chandgi Ram's assistant. Yeah, so Chandgi Ram got his daughter into it. I think her name was Sonika Kalikaraman or whatever. And then Mahavir Fogart, who was his assistant, got his daughters into it. So this whole thing was these men who don't have sons, who want to vicariously achieve something they couldn't, see the Olympics as this thing, and therefore they push their daughters into it. But that doesn't mean that women are empowered in the state overall. And of course, women's empowerment is actually, as you have pointed out, one of the key indicators of health, the kind of food that they're getting, and even the spillover effects, because a mother who's not getting enough nutrition it'll affect her, the childbirth, it'll affect what happens to the kid after that, all these massive spillover effects. So I've, everything that you said, I've kind of taken data from your chapter and sort of put it there. And I think it was important to give this data because it just speaks for itself. It is so powerful that yes, glass half full. Yeah, we're not dying at 41, we're dying at 69. That's great. But look at all these other countries. What have they achieved? And one of the things in the last episode that we did on education, you told me what really struck you was to compare India and Indonesia and say, okay, we were here at a comparable level once upon a time, and now look at them, and now look at us, and where did we go wrong, and so on. Having added to this dismal story, I'll kind of let you continue.
No, and thanks, because I think I didn't give the numbers partly because I just felt so that's a part of the chapter that's a little dry. But you're right, the numbers are very important. So I'm glad you filled that in, so then I can talk about the concept. So coming back to the research that I want to talk about, right? I think what most of your listeners probably have very little idea of is just the landscape of healthcare provision, particularly in rural India. Okay, so and this is something that not just your listeners, but the government, frankly, has no idea. Okay, and that's because the majority of health is provided by completely unqualified quacks. Okay, now we know that they exist because in household survey data, we know people are going to the private guys. But we have no data because they're technically illegal. And so that means they don't show up in any official database about, who these people are. Okay. So let me give you a little bit of my journey into kind of just the three major health studies I have done. So I can speak in a little bit more detail about my own work, but also draw in on some of the work by Jishnu and Jeff in particular to give your listeners a little bit of a capsule of what we've learned about the functioning of the healthcare system, overall. So like I said, I started this journey with kind of this project on looking at quality of public service delivery, right? And this was part of a project that was done for the World Bank's World Development Report in 2004 on making services work for the poor, or 2003. And so it had kind of a cross-country component, and part of the challenge was coming up with metrics of quality that were measurable in identical ways across contexts, okay? So, and the reason we picked up provider absence is it's a very blunt measure. Obviously, the doctor being there is necessary but not sufficient, right? I mean, he could be there and still not do anything. But it's a very, very basic blunt measure. We said, okay, like Woody Allen, I think, famously said, right? That 80% of success in life is just showing up, right? I mean, so we started that very, very basic measure. And just like we did for education, we also did for health clinics, where essentially trained enumerators made surprise visits to over close to 1,500 clinics across the country, about 80 in every state, and just measured, okay? And so what we got out of that was this estimate in 2003 that about 40% of doctors and roughly the same fraction of health personnel in general were absent on any given day, okay? And that's a shocking number, because once you take away the vacancies, right? I mean, the fact that these were conditional in the positions being filled, right? You've also got vacancies that you can see how abysmal that is in terms of the amount of services being offered. Okay. Now, one of the limitations of our All India study is we could not check, because the doctors could potentially be working, but just be on site, okay, in field visits. They could be in villages where they're supposed to be doing rounds. So there was a complementary study, in fact, done. Then nobody had them, but 3 Nobel laureates, right? So Esther Duflo, Abhijit Banerjee, and Angus Deaton. And though they fight on RCTs, they actually work together on that project, right? I mean, in Rajasthan, in Udaipur. But there, because it was one district, they were able to do much more detailed work of actually following to the village where the doctor or nurse could have plausibly been, okay? And they find that in only 10% of the cases could they find them in the field. And that the story was worse than just absence, right? The story was also one of unpredictable absence. So if I know that the doctor is predictably absent 2 days a week, okay, then that could be absence of 40%, but I know he's there on Mondays, Thursdays, and Fridays. And so as a patient, I optimize around that, and that's completely fine. The problem is that they found that you could run a regression of all the observable data and you would have zero predictive power of when this guy is going to be absent. Okay, so, and that makes it much, much more painful for the poor beneficiary who kind of has to both forego a day of earnings and pay the transport to go to one of these clinics, right? I mean, and then if you go there and find that the doctor may not even be there, that becomes much more problematic in terms of access to public healthcare. Okay, so those two studies, I think, basically focus the challenge on governance, right? Meaning that the basic governance challenges we have in the public system. Now, after that, I started working much more in education, right? And it's Jishnu and Jeff. Jishnu was then the World Bank. They're both at the World Bank. Then Jeff went to Princeton. Jishnu is now at Georgetown. So they led a lot of the work on improving measurement of how do you just measure healthcare quality. And this turns out to be a really hard problem because measuring requires, there is a possibility of under-treatment, there's a possibility of over-treatment, there's, what the quality of care is going to vary by protocol. So long story short, the method that is most commonly used in the literature to assess kind of doctor competence is what is called the method of medical vignettes. Okay, so, and the vignettes are the form that doctor qualifying exams will look like, where you say, you give the doctor a hypothetical case and you say a patient is walking into your clinic and reports symptom XYZ. Okay, so what do you do next? So the whole point of kind of good medical education is that you have a treatment protocol or a diagnosis protocol, right? So it's what is called a checklist of essential items, saying somebody walks in with the following symptoms, then, here are the first 4 things you do, right? You take the basic vital statistics, you measure temperature, you take a little bit of history and, the patterns of the fever, so you try to ask questions. So the whole point of being an effective medical provider is the patient walks in with some random symptom and mapping that symptom into an underlying diagnosis and then treating only that and not over treating, right, is the core of what you want a good doctor to do. Okay, so the first step of assessing is this provider able to do that is to then assess provider knowledge. Okay, so that's what they do with these vignettes, and they measure doctor knowledge in a bunch of studies. Okay, and this is kind of being used in multiple settings. Now, the problem with the vignettes is that the vignette only gives you a measure of doctor knowledge. Okay, it doesn't tell you anything about doctor practice, right? I mean, what does the guy actually do? When a patient walks in, right? So, you might know a lot, but choose to not exert effort. And this goes back to, again, something Ajay said, which is healthcare is not a public good. Healthcare is an inherently private good, right? Because I give it to you and not to others. It is rival because if I spend time on you, I have less time for others. So I can both exclude and it is rival. So it is not a public good at all, right? It is a classic private good. And the amount of effort you put in is costly, right? So effort is costly. And coming back, the historical anecdote which I wanted to talk about, which people may not realize, is that the British colonial healthcare system, the medical system that was set up, it was not set up to take care of the population. It was set up to take care of the collector and the superintendent of police, right? So it was a completely excludable good, right? It was the doctor, the medical officer in the district's job was to make sure that the ruling employees were healthy, right? Population to dur ki baat hai, right? That would come maybe in times of some major pandemics or something. But for the most part, it was a private good that was allocated to the elite, okay? So what they then was listen, knowledge is not enough, because when people walk into a clinic and, you've seen those papers. So what they started doing was then measuring what they call participant observations, okay, where you have people sitting in the clinic almost like, anthropology type, you're sitting and you're just coding every interaction between the doctor and the patient, okay? So patient walks in and you just observe. Now, for the first half day, one day, you might get some what are called Hawthorne effects, that they work a little harder because somebody's watching them. But after some time, we now have evidence to say that it just goes back to normal practice, okay? So that gives you a measure of effort, right? So what they were finding, and the main kind of insight from a bunch of these papers. Now, of course, this level of measurement could only be done in smaller samples, right? So they had samples in Delhi, they had, other samples. But the punchline that was coming out of all of this was that the doctors, the knowledge was low, but even conditional knowledge, the effort in the public system was incredibly weak, okay? So they kind of came up with this terminology, what they call the no-do gap, right? The gap between kind of knowledge and practice was so large that it kind of highlights, again, the importance of incentives, because you can hire people based on competence and knowledge, but that doesn't kind of ensure that they will exert effort when they actually see a patient. Now, and this is a very difficult problem, right? It's a difficult problem, and I also sympathize with the doctors in some way, because in a funny way, you almost have negative incentives for effort, right? Because if you put in a lot of effort, you get a reputation as a good doctor and you get more work, right? And you get more patients, but your compensation is not going up, your resources are not going up. There is nothing in the system that is actually variably increasing with the amount of patients you see, okay? So, and I'll come back to the separating equilibrium of how these incentives work out. And then they also looked at the private doctors and see that the private doctors in general have less knowledge, okay? But they actually work harder, because because they function closer to the frontier of their lower knowledge, right? So if quality is knowledge times effort, the public guys have more knowledge because you're recruiting based on more formal credentials. The private guys are much less qualified on average, but they work harder and they function closer to the frontier of knowledge. Okay, so that was kind of the broad message that was coming out of that work. Okay, now the limitation with that is in the participant observation. When I'm sitting in the clinic and coding the interaction, I don't know what is the underlying ailment the patient is coming with. Okay, so I can observe your bedside manner. I can observe how many questions you ask. I can observe how many medicines you give. But I have no idea if what you have done is correct, right? Because I don't know what the underlying disease is that this random patient is walking in with. Now, in the vignette, I know that, right? In the vignette, I know what the underlying case is, and I'm structuring the whole case so that a good doctor will find his or her way to the correct case and the correct diagnosis, right? So the problem in the PO measures effort, vignette measures knowledge. But I want to measure both in the same case to then really get a sense of is the doctor getting the right protocol of care, okay? And so then the big innovation, and this is, it's been used in medical studies before, but just for your listeners is a detour into the wonderful world of research, right? Is the closest to a Bollywood operation we've had in any of our research studies is if you truly want to understand both doctor knowledge and doctor practice, the only way to do this is with what are called standardized patients, okay? So these are essentially actors, who are trained to be fake patients, right? Who go in and present a set of symptoms. Now, because you know the underlying case, okay, so now you can actually assess whether the quality and the protocols the doctor is doing are correct as per the medical checklist for that case. So you both see knowledge and you effectively see the real practice of what this person is doing, okay? And then at the end of the transaction, you kind of observe the medication. So you get to observe both over medication and under medication, and you observe the fees charged. So then you can kind of analyze what are market prices, what are these prices reflecting, okay? Now, and again, this is not something we came up with, right? So standardized patients are a well-established tool for medical education in the US and Canada. So if you're a medical student, at some point in your life, you will see a standardized patient, right? So it is part of your training and part of your testing, okay? That a random person will walk in and you're going to be assessed on how you do. So the only thing is we adapted that same method for assessing the quality of actual care, okay? So this is a little bit of the research journey in terms of just the methods and the measurement. So I think Ajay last time was talking about, how little we know, and one of the reasons I thought this is a good time to do the episode is it builds up on that, that we actually do know a lot, but not as systematically as we would like to, because these were these one-off studies and we need to do a lot more of them. So, and then there was this last kind of study. So the two studies which I did then after, so Jishnu and Jeff did a bunch of these things, and then we got together in about 2010 and worked together on two major studies. So one was an all India study looking at the availability and landscape of providers in rural India. So it was a representative sample of villages, and all we did was we just went and did a census of providers, okay? So who is here, right? And where are people going to? And then on an all India basis, there was no way you could do standardized patients. And so there we measured quality just using the vignettes, okay? So that was a measure of doctor knowledge. But then in one study in Madhya Pradesh, in a second study in MP, we did a much, much deeper dive, right? Where we had these standardized patients then go and present to both public and private clinics, to go present to the same doctor in his public and private practice, okay? And we'll come back and tell you a bunch of stories about that. But, from a research perspective, those were some of the studies that were done. And yeah, I'll take a little pause and come and give you the insights. Or maybe I'll give you the insights, I'll start with the All India one maybe, right? And then take a pause and come in with the MP one after that, unless you want to come in right now.
No, I think I'll come in right now because there is so much that you mentioned to unpack. I think let's kind of unpack them one by one and come to this. And I'll get to the rural part of it and absenteeism and all of that later. But very quickly to just sort of elaborate on what you said about a vignette for the sake of my listeners. What that in real terms would be that, say, I go to the doctor and I'm the sort of actor, as it were, acting as if I have something, and I will say I have diarrhea. And then what we are measuring is what are the questions that person asked me? How relevant are they to my problem? So, these are the 5 questions that a good doctor would ask. These are the 6 things that a good doctor would check. The last of them apparently being some indentation in the temple or the head or something, which has something to do with diarrhea and so on. And you grade them based on how many of these they actually ask, which I kind of found fascinating. Now, there's this extremely interesting conversation, in the 2007 study, Jishnu Das and Jeffrey Hammer, where Das had a conversation with this doctor in a slum. And I love this conversation. So I'm just going to read it out because it is, I think, so relevant to present times also. Where this doctor says, yes, there is a lot of diarrhea and dysentery in this locality. What can they do as well? The water is dirty. People don't know how to boil it. That's why their children are always falling sick. So Jishnu asks, so what do you do for children with diarrhea? So the doctor says, what can we do? The usual things. We tell the mother to give water with salt and sugar to the baby and then also give some medicines. So Jishnu asks, such as? So the doctor says the usual Metrogyl, Loperamide, Furoxone. Forgive me for the pronunciations, young doctors. I forgive you for your handwriting. And then Jishnu says, but isn't ORS enough? ORS being oral rehydration, basically salt only. And the doctor says, of course, the WHO and the others keep saying we should only give ORS. But if I tell the mother she should go home and only give the child water with salt and sugar, she will never come back to me. She will only go to the next doctor who will give her all the medicines and then she will think that he is better than me. Stop quote. And this, of course, speaks to a classic problem that you point out about how private doctors often tend to over-prescribe for different kinds of incentives. And we'll discuss that in detail. And I, in fact, reproduced, I took a screen grab of this and put it on Twitter today because it spoke to me. Because yesterday there was an interview with Dr. Lancelot Pinto and another doctor, and I'll link it from the show notes, where they were talking about how one of the things that is making COVID worse, among the many things making COVID worse, one of the things that is making it worse is that people are just over-medicating, where Dr. Pinto's point is that even we know all the things that don't work, like plasma and ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, and even remdesivir is only in particular clinical situations is recommended. But one of the things that does work is dexamethasone, which is a corticosteroid, but even that should only be prescribed at a particular stage of the illness. And what doctors are doing is that when young people are reporting fever, they are giving steroids from then only. And what the steroid will do is it will reliably take the fever down, but it will also suppress the immune system reaction, and then you'll be hit harder with COVID. And so people are getting over that fever and then just falling apart. And it's because of this over medication that is happening. So what is required at the start is that initial fever of 4 or 5 days, you just have to live through it. That's the body's immune system. Unless your oxygen levels go down, you don't really need to do anything. That's the natural response of the body. If you over medicate at that point, you only make it worse. And one of the things that is happening is patients are asking for all of these because they will read that, array, my uncle got ill and he was given these 5 medicines and remdesivir and plasma and all of that. And doctors, under that pressure, just because their workload is so insane anyway, they'll say, fine, you can also have that. And then these people will put out calls on Twitter, plasma, remdesivir and all of that. So I thought that in these current times, that's sort of an important aside that one should make. I think the technical term for it is polypharmacy, and that this seems to be a tendency that Indians have कि कुछ भी हो गया चलो antibiotic दे दो ये दे दो, and they feel a doctor is competent if that kind of happens.
Yeah, no, I think, you're just speaking to what makes healthcare so vexing, right? Because there is kind of both, what you're describing, which is patient-induced demand, like, for things that are suboptimal, and doctor-induced demand, in other cases, right? I mean, where you're kind of, all else being equal, you recommend procedures where you make, where the revenue is, is more lucrative. And so that is a very, very difficult problem. And this is why, if you go back to look at the core of doctor training, right? Why do they spend so much time on medical ethics? Why do they spend so much time on the Hippocratic Oath? Why do they spend so much time on do no harm? It's precisely because the founders of the modern medical profession recognize just how powerful a doctor is, and that the only way to kind of even attempt this problem of kind of how much asymmetric information and power there is to actually build a more noble doctor, right? I mean, and so, if I can inculcate in you a certain intrinsic identity that says deviating from my intrinsic identity is costly, right? That's the one hope we have in the long term of actually building a better medical system. And this has to do both with doctors in terms of what they do, and also doctors' ability to resist, right? I mean, patient demand, and saying that, so, and this is why customer satisfaction that we normally use, okay, is not even always a good measure here. I think Jishnu gave me this wonderful quote once. I forget. I think it's from Canis Prendergast. There's a paper. It says, doctor's satisfaction from drug-addicted client who's assessing the doctor based on is he getting his next dose, is not a good measure of doctor quality, right? So in that sense, the measure of doctor quality is, like I said, to diagnose precisely and give you exactly what is needed and nothing more. And I remember an old conversation with Siddharth Mukherjee. He may not even remember. I think I met him once in Boston. He's at least 5 or 6 years older than me. And I remember very distinctly he told me that he said a good doctor recognizes that every medication is a poison, right? Because it is being given to kill something, okay, in the body. So you kind of want to absolutely minimize what you do to just go after what the ailment is and nothing more, right? Now, but the flip side of that is now if you take that medical ideal into the practical situation of kind of the poor in India, is that you cannot blame them, for wanting more medicines, because essentially if you are poor and you've fallen sick, you are on the verge of starvation because you don't have income, right? So the single most important kind of thing that is driving the demand for healthcare for the rural poor is, how do I get back to work? It's not they're looking for all these medicines to say, Acha, I want the steroids to give me a high. No, it is essentially every day I don't work is a day closer to destitution. And so there's no unemployment insurance, there's no safety net. And so which means that coming back to basic economics of kind of the time discounting, right? The discounting calculation you're doing is very simple. It says, yes, if I take over medication, there might be some adverse side effect in the future. But I need to survive to get to that future, right? So which means that the discount rate is very, very high. And so what may seem medically optimal, right, is often not what is optimal for the patient. And one of the things we document in our MP study is that there is a ton of overprescription, but the overprescription is not only driven by the incentives of the doctor to make more money when I give you more medicines, right? The overprescription is driven by the need for the patient to want to get symptomatic relief so that he or she is able to go back to work. And so then in a world where the doctor actually doesn't know what's going on with you, right? He gives you a cocktail hoping that something will have an effect, right? And that you'll feel better. So in that sense, the overmedication is not... It's kind of an ethically much more murky area, right? Because he's not just doing it to make money. He's doing it because he wants to help you. And what you want more than anything else is to get better enough to go back to work, right? And that's what makes the ethics of this so kind of complicated and fraught, right? So, yeah. So it's, like I said, there's only more and more profound confusion, right? That if you ask me today, what should the policy response to this be? I frankly don't have a good answer, right? It would be more along the line. And I'll come back and talk more about training and education and how you can kind of see, in a way, what you want to do is improve the doctor's ability to diagnose and credibly communicate that to the patient, right? So that the doctor can act as this trusted filter of both what you need and what you don't need in a world where, there isn't this immediate competitive pressure or the sense of saying, "Ki, acha, agar dawai nahi diya to doctor acha nahi hai," right? So, yeah, injection nahi diya to doctor acha nahi hai, right? So there are these, tropes that people have, and these are very, very, very complicated issues to solve.
This is really fascinating. In fact, this is a classic example where real medicine might have a placebo effect because the patient, feels that if they are given an actual, medicine, instead of just being told that go home and, put some salt in your water and drink that. And come on, yaar. If I'm paying good money to see a doctor, how can you tell me to drink salt water? Kuch to do. The other sort of observation that you made before I come to my question, and I found this so fascinating and so telling, is this rule of three. This is from the Das and Hammer study, where Das and Hammer write that, quote, the average interaction with a doctor in our sample is governed by the rule of three, stop quote. And then they write, the patient arrives 3 days after becoming sick. The doctor spends 3.8 minutes and asks 3.2 questions, after which the patient leaves with 2.6 different medicines, 0.5 of which are antibiotics. Stop quote. And such a fantastic illustration. Now, question number 1, what does this tell us, this rule of three? And question number 2, in a larger sense, and this goes across multiple studies which you'd shared with me, what do we know about the difference between private and public doctors, both in terms of their competence, in terms of their effort? Is there a sort of a distinction depending on, the locality they are in? If they're in a rich locality or a poor locality, is there a distinction between a doctor in a hospital and a doctor with his private clinic? And is there a distinction with a doctor who is both? By day, he's a doctor in a public clinic, but also has his own private practice outside. Now, all of these are nuances you have explored. So, give us the dope.
Yeah, so I think let me just start with some basic facts, right? I think that's the easiest place to start, right? So what did we do in this kind of All India study that just was published in the Social Science and Medicine last year? And this is the paper that's called The Two Indias, right? So what we did was had a representative sample of villages where we just went and first counted, right? I mean, who are all the providers, and then did a random sample where we went and administered these vignettes. So I think the goal is just to characterize the landscape, right? Who are these providers? Ho kya raha hai, right? I mean, and so the main punchline that comes out of this is that over 70% of the overall provision of healthcare in rural India is coming from the private sector. And the majority of these private providers have no formal qualifications whatsoever. Okay, so these are what you would call quacks, okay? But we need to kind of put a lot of nuance into this term quack, okay, which I'll come to in a second, okay, about who are these quote-unquote doctors, okay? So that's fact number one, okay, about the structure of the healthcare system is that 70% is private, most of them are quacks, and this is not even including people with legitimate qualifications who are practicing outside their area of training. So you have the traditional Indian medicine, people who have Ayurveda and Unani and homeopathy kind of degrees, but are actually practicing allopathy, right? I mean, and that's, again, reflects the fact that, these alternative systems are meant to be more about wellness rather than cure. But the patient is not interested in wellness. Patient goes for cure. And so they end up kind of dispensing the same allopathic medicine that gives you the symptomatic relief. So that is fact number one. Okay. The share is mainly private and more than 50% are unqualified. The other important fact is that this is above 50% in literally every state in India. Okay, so except Kerala, which is about 47%, even there, so the private share is very, very big. Okay, so it's not the fact, and this is a little subtle. Okay. It's not the fact that Tamil Nadu and Kerala that have better public systems have less private, okay? They also have more private, but their private is much better, okay? So, and this is a very deep and subtle point I want to make, which is coming back to your story about when the elites have exited from the private sector, why do we care about improving the public, okay? And the subtle point is that the reason I care about state capacity and improving public systems is that not only does it directly benefit those who use the public system, it also indirectly benefits everybody uses the private system because the private is forced to compete with the improving public. So when the public option gets better, you are also automatically forcing out the left tail of the distribution of the private providers and forcing the private distribution up, correct? So there's that overall spillover in the economy that is not being accounted for in terms of the value of investing in strong public systems, okay? So the second key fact is that as your systems get better, it is not that the private goes away, but the private gets better. Okay, so the public is pushing up the base, and that is in fact a tide that lifts all the boats. Okay, so that's the second key fact. The third is just how much variation there is across the country, right? I mean, and so if you look at these vignettes and look at the quality, what you'll see is that nurses and sometimes even the unqualified providers in Tamil Nadu and Kerala do better on these vignettes than even people notionally with MBBS degrees in UP and Bihar. Okay, now, and again, this is not to malign UP and Bihar, but I suspect it speaks to the quality of medical education or the fact that you can get through. There are probably more kind of fake colleges. I don't know enough about this, right? I mean, but it certainly highlights, I would say, the value of, say, some of these national systems like NEET and NEXT. Okay, that says let's have a standardized entrance test, a standardized exit test, so that regardless of what your kind of training program is, that you have to show on a certain common standard, right? I mean, that you've achieved. So the other key fact which I want people to understand, and this is more from my fieldwork rather than systematic data collection, is a little bit more about who these quacks are, okay? So how have they become so prevalent and why are they all over the place? So two things. One, that the state is often not there. And second, even if the state is there, the state is not accountable, right? So one of the striking findings we have in our MP study is that the share of the private guys is above 60 or 70%, even when you have a public MBBS doctor posted in the village, okay? So it's not just a question of have you posted a public doctor, because the public doctor is often not there. So coming back to who these private quacks are, see, most of them have done what you would call an informal apprenticeship. okay, that they have shadowed a regular doctor, and kind of been in this guy's clinic for a year or two, observed a bunch of what he does, and then they say, okay, I'm ready to go off and kind of do my own thing. Okay, now, and as with any skilling program or apprenticeship program in India, there is so much variation in the quality of who you shadowed that automatically then means that there are some of these guys who are not bad at all because they've actually informally imbibed some pretty good practices, and then there are others who are abysmal. Okay, so that's one part about who these people are. Now, but the second thing that's important to understand about why they are not these evil there's a sense that, oh, they're these evil profiteering quacks, okay? But that I think is far from the case because they're often highly embedded and very, very respected in their communities because they are the only people providing care and they have to live in that community, right? So, in fact, the best incentive for them not to do something wrong is if something bad happens on their watch, they're going to get beaten up, okay? And that's often a better incentive. So, Jishnu has sent me stories about, people getting beaten up, if the community feels that the doctor has done something bad. So in that sense that they are not formally qualified, but they are embedded in their communities. They have kind of some experience, some practice. And then the other source by which they learn things is the informal education. And again, this is not in the data set, but it comes from my field conversations with these guys, is they actually get a fair bit of continuing medical education from pharmacy representatives, okay? Because the pharmacy guys, the government might not know who these guys are, but every pharmacy rep knows them because that's where the medicines are being pulled through. So the pharmacy reps will have in their beat the data of all of these informal providers and they will make sure they've gone and visited them. And so that becomes like a source of, now, of course, it's petrifying to think about then how much influence a pharmacy rep has in terms of over medication because these guys then have incentives to push more medicine. So, but it's just giving you some sense of the lay of the land, right? I mean, about who these guys are and that they account for the lion's share of healthcare in the country. Now, then coming back to the research about the quality, right? So, it is one thing to say that they exist and this is what they look like on paper, okay? But what can I say about their actual quality? And that is what the MP study does, right? Because what the MP study does is it takes measurement very, very seriously. And this is a paper in the American Economic Review. And what we do is we have these standardized patients and we draw a random sample of villages and we make a census of all of the providers. And then we randomly draw samples of public and private clinics. And then we send these SPs over a period of time to go present their cases, right? So then we can observe exactly the quality of care that's happening in the public and the private, the qualified, the unqualified, and then just understand that broad gamut. So, again, this is one state. It's, about 160 villages actually, but it's better data than we have anywhere else. So it's the best we have right now. But the key kind of big picture messages are the private guys know less, okay, because they're less qualified, but they systematically work harder, okay? And now by work harder, it means they're spending more time, they're asking more questions, they're getting more of the items on the checklist, okay? And so when you put that picture together, the overall quality of care that you get from these quacks is not different from what you get from the public health clinic. And now this is because when you go into the PHC, most of the time the doctor is not seeing you because the doctor is not there. So even in the public system, you're being seen by a ward boy or a compounder or somebody who's not actually formally qualified, but who just happens to be there, minding the store. So in that way, the private guy who's less qualified, is not giving you any inferior care. Now, but going back to something we said in the education episode, the absolute quality of care is abysmal, right? I mean, so it's just like those two bears I talked about last time, right? The private guy just has to be slightly better than the public guy. That's why improving public is so important, right? Because it forces the private guy to up his game as well. So what you have today is overall, the public system hires more qualified people, but because it doesn't have its governance act together, right? I mean, and you can't get accountability for a variety of reasons, that the effort is really low. The private guys have lower knowledge, but much higher effort, okay? And so put together, the composite result of that is that the private guy is at least no worse, okay? It's slightly better, but at least no worse. And just like education, right? So just like my school voucher study, we found exactly the same thing, right? That the private school teachers are much less qualified, but they work much harder. So the net result is that the value added is comparable, but they do it at a much lower cost per child. And that's because the salaries of the private school teachers are about 1/5. And so similarly here, what you'll see is that the cost per patient in the private sector is substantially lower because most of these guys, they charge fees. Whereas once you add all the salary costs in the public system and divide that by kind of the utilization, you get a much higher cost per patient for comparable quality. So I'll stop there and then come back to this other even more cool study where we then look at the dual sample of the same doctor in his public and private practice. But let me just pause for a moment on this representative sample and get you in there.
Yeah, like first of all, as an aside again, like one of the statistics that we know about education is also true of healthcare. I found out while reading your chapter in these papers, which is that even though people have free public options available, they still prefer to go by and large to private doctors, and that in itself is telling. Now, I'll quickly summarize in sort of two separate buckets a bunch of insights that really struck me, and you can tell me where I'm making a mistake or you'd like to add something to that. And one is the urban bucket, which is what these Das and Hammer studies look at specifically in Delhi and all of that, where they kind of point out that, look, there is a stark difference between the private guys and the public guys, but there are nuances within that. Like, number one, the private guys always show more competence and more effort. But then within the private guys, there are two categories. One is the MBBS guys who are actually trained, and the other is the untrained guys. Within the untrained guys, there will be the Ayush guys who you could argue have been trained wrongly, and the apprentice type people who are, picking it up from a proper doctor and kind of taking that. And everywhere you find that not only does private outperform public, but in different localities, private and public will both rise, though the difference between them will be there. And in poorer localities, whether it's private or public, it will be much worse than in a richer locality. So the locality matters a hell of a lot. Now, that is the urban India ka, the little snapshots that we got. In rural India, what I kind of found fascinating was how in your paper on Two Indias, you've described how people travel for medical care, where you write, quote, people may visit the clinic in their village, but if they have something more serious, they will go to the highway. And if they have something really major, they will take a bus and go to the city. But people will almost never travel from one village to another. Stop quote. You also point out that, quote, a high quality provider who is posted to a village will spend a much smaller portion of the day seeing patients compared to a provider in a district hospital. Stop quote. And then you make a point that you also made in the education episode in that context, that sometimes better roads are more useful than more rural clinics. That you want to connect a patient with a healthcare, and if you can't take Muhammad to the mountain, you get the mountain to him. So if you can't provide that excellent medical service at his village, if you just provide better roads, better maybe mobile connectivity or whatever, then he can access that better care. But here I have a question. Like, the vast majority of the care that is kind of being accessed is private here, and you've pointed out that in your study you find that there are 3.2 doctors per village and only 2.8% of them have an MBBS, right? And while there is variation between states, the state of affairs is kind of ubiquitous. So now when I connect this with how you describe the travel, that if it's something immediate, like if I have diarrhea or a cold, I'll go to the local guy, and if it's something a little more serious, I'll go to the highway, and if it's something really, really serious, I'll take a bus to the nearby town if it's possible. Now, what this therefore would imply is that even if the so-called doctor is not that trained, doesn't have a degree, the point is that a common cold gets better on its own. It's a reversion to the mean kind of thing. Many of these common things that they would go for, like even diarrhea, will kind of get better. And it'll almost be folk wisdom that have, salt in water and all of that by now. So, is that's what playing out there? That they're going out to a private doctor in a situation where it's not serious to begin with, and it doesn't really matter if the doctor is good or not. I mean, if you have 3.2 per village and only 2.8 have MBBS, they obviously can't treat anything serious. For the serious stuff, you're going elsewhere anyway. So it's almost like placebo doctors. I mean, the reason a lot of quackery appears to work to people, and I have written frequently on this in various places, the reason a lot of quackery appears to work is two reasons. One is, of course, the placebo effect, which is far more powerful than we realize, which is why every proper piece of medicine has to pass a double-blind placebo test. And by the way, no homeopathic medication has ever passed something like that. And the other reason is reversion to the mean, in the sense that many diseases just happen and get better on its own, including in the vast majority of cases, even COVID, where you'll get fever for a week or you'll be asymptomatic and it will just get better. And if at the peak of your symptoms you take some medicine, you will ascribe it to that correlation and causation. And you will imagine that's what is causing the problem. So is this part of the situation that the fact is, at one level I get it that Indian Medical Association now keeps protesting that there are so many quacks. Now at one level I get the argument that listen, the state isn't there, proper doctors aren't there, but these are people who might be able to help in some way, so let's not demonize them. I get that argument, but at the same time, could these just be placebo doctors, in the sense they're not doctors at all, and these are not, you feel good that you're going to someone and he's giving you medicine, but you were going to get better anyway.
Yeah, so I think, I don't know the full answer to that question, right? Because we didn't do a study on placebos. Now, what I can say is that because we are codifying the quality of treatment, right? Because in these SP cases, we know, right? We know the underlying ailment. And see, you're absolutely right that in the majority of the case, you actually don't need medication, right? But the truth is, the reason you want the doctor is not for your average case, but to be able to say, are you in that 5% of cases where you actually need the attention, right? So, in fact, the SP case that we have is a case where the patient walks in and says, I have had some pain in my chest. Okay. And now this could be anything from a heart attack on the extreme, or it could just be that I had a slight sprain and that I slept in the wrong posture. And like 9 times out of 10, it'll turn out to be completely benign. Correct. But the reason you go to the doctor is not to get the treatment, but to kind of get the pathway of questioning to say, which is why the right questions you ask are, what is the nature of the pain? Is it a throbbing pain? Is it a vibrating pain? Is it a pulsating pain? Right. So the point of the doctor is not to cure you, but to then identify whether you need referral to something more, right? Which is why the cases are designed precisely, right? To reflect symptoms that, I think in one of the cases, it's like I have a hard time breathing. Okay, so now it could be asthma, which needs training, or it could be just an allergy, or it could be, some short-term adverse reaction to something. So again, the cases are designed in a way as to be cases where you can measure both omission and commission. The bottom line is coming back to the absolute quality of care in our data, right? If you say what fraction of these providers correctly give you the correct treatment, it is abysmally low. Okay, it is only about 15% in the public sector and about 22% in the private. So that's why I said the private does better. It's 50% better, but in absolute levels, it's still abysmally low. Okay, now, but these guys are mostly unqualified. But where it gets very interesting, if you look at public versus private, is because the problem here is the qualifications of these guys are different, right? So if you want to really isolate the effect of private sector incentives, so the really cool part of the study is then we found the same doctors, right? So the same guy in his public practice and private practice. So now the knowledge is constant. And what we did over a period of time, he got the same case in both his public and private practice, obviously with different actors. It's not Amit going to both the practices, but the same case. And what you saw was that the quality of care was better in the private practice on every measure, right? So there is higher effort, there is more likely to be a correct treatment, there's less likely to be unnecessary treatment. So in every way that there is more effort being put in. Okay, so to answer your question about the larger gamut of rural healthcare and saying how much of this is just placebo, I think, my view on this is that yes, only about 15 to 20% of the cases actually got it correct. Now, does that mean the remaining 80% are placebo? Possibly no, because a lot of what they are giving is also what we call palliative relief, right? So it may not cure your underlying symptom, but it is still giving you some utility in terms of, making you able to go back to work. Okay. Now, the question, of course, is that steroid or whatever thing they're giving you as a painkiller, what long-term cost is it coming at? And then it goes into this very complicated issue of what is the patient's discount rate, right? So if this is a patient who says, I need to get better today because if I don't work, I don't have food to put on the table, then can you really blame the doctor or the patient, for over-medicating on the palliative stuff, if that's what allows the patient to get back to work, okay? So I think that's what makes this so difficult. Now, and maybe I'll pause here and then we can come back and talk. Maybe we should switch to talking about policy, right? Because I think it's very, very, very difficult. I think Ajay's view on this was we just don't even know enough, that we just need to spend time collecting data. I have some views, at least on principles of how I would structure policy based on kind of the work and the evidence we have. And, maybe we should switch to that. And that way we can, bring all these facts together to say, because right now it almost feels like I've given you this, broad smorgasbord of facts, but organizing this into saying, how do we take this understanding into thinking about policy is then something that I need to spend some time on, which we can do next.
So a couple of things I want to double click into, and this might take us into the realm of policy, but even if it doesn't, we'll talk about policy anyway after this. And here are the two things I want to double click into. One is talking about public incentives and the other is private competence. And when we speak about the public health system, right? We've got the 5 tier system. We've notionally got all these doctors in every village, in every town, in every district, whatever. But there is high absenteeism, right? The classical explanation for why private always performs better than public is incentives. Because in public, you've got a tenured job, there's no accountability, and those are your incentives, and that's how it functions. So, first question, what are the ways to improve these incentives? Like, once we take it for granted, because the public reflects this, that repeatedly, like in education, they will ignore the free option and they'll go to a paid private guy. Clearly something is seriously wrong. Now, if we accept that the market can't take care of everything in something like healthcare, then in that case we have to focus on this and we have to figure out better incentives. One way, like we discussed, is more local government, but that isn't going to happen anytime soon, and that in any case we will discuss in our episode on federalism. So what are the sort of ways of improving these public incentives for public healthcare workers?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and maybe I will park it for the policy piece. But let me say one other important thing, right? That what is really interesting about why we call the paper Two Indias is, like, if you look at, say, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and some of the better performing states, it's that not only do they deliver better care, but they also deliver it at a much lower cost per patient. Okay, so how are they achieving higher quality and lower cost? It's because the utilization of the doctor is higher, okay? Because the biggest cost in the system is your doctor's salary, right? But if people have confidence in the public system that everybody is coming, right, then your cost per patient is actually lower, and the equilibrium is unraveled, where, not only are they not that good, but if you don't know if they're there, you're not even going to show up, okay? So the patient doesn't go, and then you kind of, the whole thing unravels into a low-level equilibrium, right? So I think it just highlights the broader value of investing in public systems, okay? Now, this is spoken from as somebody who has documented that the private incentives do better. But my overall view in terms of architecting systems of service delivery is that the public and private both have their weaknesses. They have different pathologies, right? So at one level, a public provider should be able to do better. Why? Because there is no profit motive, and therefore you don't have to kind of charge more to make the fat cat salaries of your corporate executives who are running the private firms. At another level, they have scale in procurement. Okay, so it gives you volume discounts, whether it's on your medication or your supplies. You have scale in terms of cost of capital if you need to borrow for infrastructure, and you have the natural scale that comes from being so. Combination of lack of profit motive and combination of economies of scale, all else being equal, should make the public a potentially better provider, right, like of value for money than the private guy. But the elephant in the room, of course, is incentives, right? So what the private guy has is much better incentives, right? So essentially, he doesn't get paid if he doesn't show up, right? I mean, whereas the public guy, once you have the salary. So, one very interesting way of thinking about public versus private in the COVID context is like, is the public unions fight to stay shut, the private guys fight to open, right? And that itself is a very telling this thing about, the distinction of the incentives, because you only get paid, right, if you're there, okay? So now, and which is why I think the public versus private debate itself is so different and should be different in different parts of the world. Okay, so I think and part of the nuance in that AER paper, right, where we kind of allude to the fact that Ken Arrow was not fully right. It's always a dangerous proposition to start a paper saying that Ken Arrow was wrong. So, because he's it was the most brilliant economist of the 20th century. But, the caveat is not that he's wrong, but that he was right only in the setting he had seen. Like, he had not actually seen what the wild west of kind of healthcare in rural India looks like, right? So, in fact, as an aside, sometimes it's interesting, right, how some of the great ideas in modern applied microeconomics that won Nobel Prizes, like, for people like Stiglitz and Akerlof, actually came when they spent a year in developing countries, right? So Joe Stiglitz spent a year in Kenya. Akerlof wrote his Lemons paper from his time in India when, it's like studying development economics is a little bit like studying pathology in medicine. So pathology is you look at the dead patient and saying what did not work, right? So when something is working, you don't see how beautiful it is that all parts of the system are working, right? So it's only when something is dysfunctional that you then go and understand the importance of things you took for granted institutionally, right? And so similarly, for kind of Western educated economists who kind of model the world in a certain way, you put them in a developing country where these kind of markets don't exist, and then you kind of say, oh my God, wait, there is all of these problems of asymmetric information, and then they kind of embellish their models for this work that then went and won a Nobel Prize. But anyway, so maybe my point here is if Arrow had spent time in rural India, he would have modified, some of his theorems as well. But what we are basically showing, we have this theoretical model in that AER paper, right, where we say that, listen, market incentives are both good and bad, okay? Because what we see in the pricing equation is that the price a doctor charges is correlated with observable measures of effort, right? So the price is higher if I spend more time, the price is higher if I do more checklist items, and the price is higher if I give you more medication, okay? Because those are things that the patient can see. Now, what is really ironic is that there is no price premium for giving the correct treatment because the patient doesn't know if the treatment is correct, okay? But unconditionally, you are paid more if you give the correct treatment because when you give more medicines, you are mechanically more likely to also give a correct treatment, okay? So it's like, you throw the kitchen sink at it and something will stick, okay? So, but the subtle point is this, that doctor incentives, of say private incentives, are good because it gives you incentives to work harder for the patient to come back to you. But it also gives you negative incentives for over-prescribing, right? And so the question is, how do you find the right balance between having enough incentives for effort, but not enough incentives for over-treatment, right? And that's the delicate balance we're trying to find. Now, the traditional modern Western medicine approach for this is you train on medical ethics. You try to train with, say, Hippocratic Oath, and you kind of have a group of peers and you have a strong liability regime that says if you're found to have violated what is kind of standard practice, so there are other institutional ways of kind of checking this, right? But the general sense in the US is that the better working health systems are ones that don't give doctors too much incentives, but you want to weaken their incentives and focus more on kind of intrinsic motivation of quality of care. So if you look at, say, a Mayo Clinic where the doctors are paid on a flat salary with not that much kind of bonuses based on procedures, the sense is that you get better care there. Or what Ajay was saying, what a CMC Velo does, so at the high end of kind of the healthcare system, the best systems are where you have well-trained doctors who have a strong sense of ethics and who are practicing in a community of peers, whereby you kind of reinforce good practice because of the norms that are built around you, okay? Now, the problem is, when you come to India, we are at the opposite end of that, right? Which is that the effort in the public sector is so low that the marginal incentives. So here's what happens, right? When I increase your incentives, I'm increasing incentives for diagnostic effort, but I'm also increasing incentives for overtreatment, right? But the returns to the diagnostic effort is diminishing in how much time I'm spending, right? So in the US, if my default interaction is 20 minutes with the patient, then the marginal returns to more diagnostic effort is not that high. But in India, if it's 2 minutes, right, then the marginal return to that extra diagnostic effort is high. So part of what we argue in that model is there's a crossing property that if you're at a very low level of baseline effort, then having more incentives is actually better because those benefits outweigh the costs, right? Whereas if you are at a point where the baseline effort is already high, now putting incentives backfires because now I'm incentivizing overtreatment. Okay, so it just kind of highlights how difficult these issues are. But coming back to the Indian setting and policy, and maybe we'll take a short break and come back, is that architecting systems so that you have some incentives but not too much is kind of what is the really delicate balance of this. And hopefully we can talk, I'll talk through some ideas for that when we get there.
And my other sort of double click question before we get there, one of course was about incentives in the public sector, but the other is about the competence of the private sector. In the sense you pointed out that, look, most people are going to private providers. A very small percentage of these are properly trained MBBS guys, and even a large percentage of the MBBS guys aren't particularly competent when it comes to all these checklist vignettes and all that. So then the question is, how do we solve for this? Because like Ajay pointed out in his episode, he used a telling phrase that, look, it's expensive to manufacture a doctor, which is true. And there are supply constraints, like the Indian Medical Council had done an episode on this once, a group of doctors, and they act like they kind of cartelize the whole thing. They restrict the supply of doctors, and that's a separate problem. And assume for a moment that is just there. It is how it is. It is expensive to manufacture a doctor. So can something like AI play a part in this? Like Ajay spoke about AI plus nurse. Now that seems an interesting formulation to me because one, AI has come a long way. Like Eric Topol has this great book called Deep Medicine, for example, about how AI and doctors can work together. And two, when I think of this vignetting, for example, you have a chest pain or you have a diarrhea and you go to a doctor and there's a checklist. Now a checklist can easily be encoded in an app where, it doesn't have diagnostic authority or whatever, but you can go through the checklist and at the end of it, you can say, okay, I don't need to go to a doc. I'll just drink some salt water and I'll see if I'm better tomorrow. Or it's not pulsating, so I don't really need to worry. I probably slept in the wrong position or whatever. I'm just thinking aloud. This is by no means a medical this thing. Can technology in a sense save us? Not as, not in terms of replacing doctors, but maybe as a tool to doctors, maybe as a tool for these informal doctors where, it's there with them.
No, absolutely. And, I think most of the policy solutions I'll talk about will have a technology layer, right? And I think one way to think about this is that technology in any sector, okay, whether it's education, whether it's health, and other examples, technology is a force multiplier. But again, for the technology to be effective, you need to first understand what the binding constraint is, and then make sure the technology is targeting that binding constraint. And one of the things we did not talk about in our education episode is we didn't talk about education technology, right? And so since I haven't done research on technology in health, but I have done research on technology in education, let me give you this quick analogy, right? Which is, in theory, the technology can do amazing things, okay? It can help give you high quality content with the best professors for everybody. It can help, make the material more interactive, more engaging. It can customize the learning. It can shorten the feedback loop. It can do all of these great things, okay? So, and therefore you have a lot of tech evangelism in education. Till you go look at the data, if you go look at the actual RCT evidence on technology in education, you'll find that the results are all over the place, okay? There are cases where the impacts on learning are negative. There are cases where there are zero, and there are cases where it is positive, right? So, and it is negative in cases where people are blindly giving computers to teenagers and who are then spending a lot more time playing games. It's neutral in cases where I just give you a laptop, okay? And it is positive when I take the effort to integrate pedagogy with the technology, right? So I think my quick answer to this is technology can be a huge force multiplier, but there are 2 or 3 key caveats. One is kind of making sure that it is designed to address the binding constraints, and making sure that we are designing the incentives for the innovation to solve at scale for populations without purchasing power, right? Because the problem is, if you look at innovation is typical, and this is true in edtech as well, right? That innovation is driven at the right tail of the distribution where there is the paying customer. Whereas what you really want is to direct that innovation, like, at the bottom of the pyramid. And that's where, again, you need the government to kind of play a little bit of an enabling role, and maybe that's a good place to start, right? Like, when we get into the detailed discussion on policy.
So let's talk about policy now. We know the problems. We know some of the problems. In fact, we think we know the problems, and then, like you said, is very vexatious. Where do we begin to think in terms of fixing these problems?
Mm-hmm. So let me start first with some core principles of public finance, right? Which is, so Indian health expenditure overall health expenditure is comparable to other, say, South Asian countries, but public health expenditure is lower. Okay, so there's a lot more out-of-pocket spending. So I think there's definitely room for increase in public spending on health. Now, but it is incredibly important to think about the cost effectiveness of that spending, because again, a big part of the research is how much variation there is in different ways of spending that money, right? So first, let's start with the first principles of public finance of saying, if I were to have a marginal increase in health expenditure, where should that go? Okay, and where it should first and foremost go are in the public goods, right? And that is public health, preventive health that works at a population level. And again, Ajay said this, but this is so important, it's worth reinforcing again and again and again, right? That, oxygen cylinders and ventilators are not public health, right? So the mind gets concentrated on the immediate life-saving device and the constraint, okay? But that is still essentially a private good that provides healthcare to one person, okay? And it is rival, it is excludable, okay? Now, what is public health, say in the COVID context? Public health would be things like, and I'll talk specifically about COVID later, would be things like universal masking, right? Where there are public goods and externalities, and we'll talk about that. But even more basically, things like air pollution. Okay, so my first and almost counterintuitive message on health policy is that sometimes the most effective return on investments may lie completely outside the health department. Okay, so when we think about health policy, we think about what does the Ministry of Health do. But the Ministry of Health, basically, again, like Ajay said, thinks of itself mainly as a PSU running the public healthcare system. Okay, but that is not health, that is not well-being, that's not quality of life. Okay, so for example, I would say the single most important thing we could do for population health is actually fix air pollution in North India. Okay, and so the calculations on this just show that the costs are of the orders of just several hundreds of billions of dollars, right? And whether it's the life expectancy, whether it's the health adjusted life expectancy, the returns on fixing that are huge. Now, the problem is that we have boxed our environmental discourse in two ways. Okay, one, it has been framed as a trade-off between kind of industrialization and economic activity versus environmental regulation. Okay, so the Greens are essentially presented as being anti-growth. Okay, and so somehow there is this trade-off, and then and there's also obviously virtue signaling sometimes from the environmental folks, and so that's one kind of trap we get stuck in. Okay, of green versus growth. Okay, which is mistake number one. Second mistake we make is we kind of get caught in the politics of kind of global climate change negotiations, right? I mean, where we say that, listen, the West has done has polluted. And so now, we need our space to pollute, okay? For us to grow. But that is like cutting your nose to spite your face, because forget the global externalities, right? Just the domestic health externalities alone, make this a first order crisis that you want to work on, right? So now, and that brings me back to why I actually think the high petrol taxes are a good thing, okay? And that's because, as a government, when you need to raise revenue, right? Any government needs revenue for its core operations, right? Now, so what is Public Finance 101? Again, it's very obvious, but we don't really think about it this way, because most governments in the revenue department thinks about their target for how much revenue I'm raising, okay? But there is a separate point of not quantity of revenue, but quality of revenue, right? What is the quality of your revenue? And there, the Public Finance 101 is to say that you want to tax bads and not goods, correct? So if I tax labor supply, I am reducing your incentives to work, and that is bad, okay? But if I tax alcohol or if I tax pollution, right, then I'm raising my revenue, but I'm also getting the price right or closer to what is socially optimal. Okay, so just by those first principles, right? Now, of course, you could argue that with, say, high petrol taxes, there is inflationary pressures across the economy and all of this kind of stuff. But overall, right, my meta view is, given that the government has certain revenue needs, that you're much better off, right? Taxing carbon, right? Through the form of high gasoline taxes. Now, it's a separate matter that is being used to hide and cover a bunch of other fiscal mismanagement. But my preferred way of communicating the health value of the petrol taxes would be to say that you justify this and saying we are doing this because we're going to take these taxes and reinvest in public transport, reinvest in public health. So one of the chapters in the whole book is on the revenue side of public finance, right? So I think one of the other problems of state capacity we have in India is that the fiscal compact between the state and the citizen is broken, okay? Which is because the tax-paying classes have completely seceded from being recipients of services. You kind of see that the taxes going into this black hole called the government that wastes all your money, which means tax evasion almost becomes quasi-justified in the evading classes, saying, anyway the government is going to waste this money, okay? So part of state capacity is also re-establishing the fiscal compact, right? That as citizens, when you pay taxes, you can expect a certain amount of public goods and services. And this takes me back to urban, right? So I talk much more about property taxes, and why I think we need more decentralization property taxes is it allows you to build a better connection in the taxpayer's mind between the taxes that are being paid and the services that are being received, as opposed to taxes going into this black hole called the government, right? So if you did the same thing with the carbon taxes and saying, yes, I am charging this for petrol, but there is a reason, and that's because here are all the environmental costs, here are all the congestion costs, and we're going to take this money and we're going to, I think government of Delhi got pilloried a little bit for saying free bus tickets for women or something. But subsidizing mass public transit is actually a wonderful thing, because you're also cross-subsidizing that from the car-owning class. So they might cry, from the rooftops, but that is good policy. It's good policy to increase the cost of carbon, and use that for, higher density, more efficient mass transport. And if you were able to make that ring fencing so that the taxpayer understands that, I think that's actually a good policy. Okay, so that's just one aside on that. Now, the other places where the highest returns to public spending may happen outside the health ministry, we already talked about this, is in the context of infrastructure. So roads was one piece, but broadband is another. Okay, so then coming back to how do you get quality of care to remote areas, right? Because the problem today, we talk about doctor absence, but frankly, I remember presenting this doctor absence paper in 2004 somewhere at the World Bank, and I think somebody from Russia had this very insightful comment where he said, even Stalin could not get his doctors to go to remote areas, okay? Now, maybe the Tamil Nadu Stalin will succeed because it's, it's different. But, even the Russian Stalin could not get doctors in remote rural areas because, they're just they're too educated to want to live in the rural areas, and the utilization is too low. Okay, so one of the ways technology or broadband or these things can help is them leveraging that kind of higher qualified doctor to be able to cater to larger populations. So now the question is, when we look at the infrastructure budget, the health ministry is not even thinking about this, right? So at the very least, what I would like is to a finance department is thinking about these allocations, find a way to quantify, say, the health benefits or something like this, and and therefore put correspondingly more money in some of those broader public goods that will have higher returns. So that's one principle, okay, of public goods. Now, the other piece which I'll then come to is public health, preventive health, primary care, and I'll come to that in a moment, but I'll pause and let you come in.
No, I will just sort of express my disagreement about the petrol thing because number of reasons. Number one, even this government, I hope they don't get the idea from listening to this podcast, but even this government hasn't presented it as a sin tax or a carbon tax or as equivalent to, oh, we are taxing alcohol so the guy won't go and beat up his wife. Secondly, I think to think of it only as something that emits carbon and pollutes the air and is bad for health is a problem, because I think the positive externalities are far greater, in the sense that I don't see how you can argue for building roads at one end and at the same time for taxing petrol more at the other. I think you should build roads and not tax petrol or keep the taxes as low as possible for the same damn reason, because people getting around becomes so much easier, and that's so much better for the economy. That's so much better for everybody's
the simple
overall
tweak here
well-being.
is you build the roads and kind of you subsidize the mass transit, right? Like, so you do the buses and not the cars. You see, that's the basic point. So it's not, so there is still higher density transport, right? All else being equal, higher density is going to
Sure,
be
but
better.
my point is that after you fix that public transit, then you do whatever when people are using that. See, what is happening here is that the state is failing in all these ways, and then it is, and this is a common story in India, the state will fail completely and it will tell private guys you also can't do. And this seems similar to that. We don't have that public transit, which brings me to my other objection where you speak about how it's a good idea if you tax carbon because then you can reinvest some money in public transport and this and that and all of that. But no, yaar, the money is going into statues and Central Vista
correct.
and all of these other things.
But see, hang on, you can't have it both ways, right? You can't say I want state capacity and you can't. So I think, but this is the challenge, right? So there's the public choice view that says, listen, like politicians are venal and they're going to take our tax money and essentially kind of do their vanity projects, in which case you should shrink the state and just kind of get away, just forget, then why are we talking about state capacity, right? Because we don't trust the state, okay? Now, the flip side of that is that this goes back to my point about the plane that is India, right? And so the private option essentially has worked for the people who are flying first in business class, right? Who have kind of seceded from the state. But the reason there is no question of kind of giving up on the state is multiple things, right? So one is there are certain core functions like justice and law that the state has a natural monopoly in, okay? Second, in terms of actual public goods, public health, environment, vector control, again, private, for all the private philanthropy and initiative, there is no substitute for the sheer scale and coordination that comes from getting the government to do its job. Okay, I think the answer is just more engagement by the elites, right? So in the end, so in this way, I think I'm more on the Ashwin Mahesh side of things, right? I think you guys had the same back and forth, right? Where Ashwin was talking about what we need to do to take back the government, right? So there is
No,
yeah.
I agree with that aspect of it. My problem here is that you are proposing a real world action which is tax petrol more based on a utopian argument that that it will be okay to tax petrol more if the state can do all of these things.
No, but think about this at a margin.
The point is the state is not doing any of those things. And the other point I want to make is that when you talk about the India plane and the rich can buy private goods and all of that, the point is roads are good for everyone, including the poor. And I would argue that keeping petrol prices low are also good for everyone, including the poor.
So I think, let's put it this way, right? There are two separate questions, okay? One is, what does the government do with any amount of money, okay? The second is saying that we want the government to make certain core investments, right? So suppose there is a menu of investments post-COVID, right? That we say these are clearly high return public investments, okay? Now, there is always a possibility of saying we will not raise taxes, let's cut down all of our inefficient spending, okay, and then move it to the more efficient ones, okay, which would be my preferred outcome, okay. Now, the political reality of reforms and expenditure is that it's very, very hard to change existing patterns of spending. What you can do is when there is additional money, you can use that in a better way, okay. Now, one way is to say that along with growth, as the budgets grow, you use that marginal extra money to do better things and don't raise taxes. But on the other hand, if the Department of Revenue is given a target and saying like, I want you to raise so much money, okay? And that is coming from the political bosses. Now, the Revenue Department then has a choice of saying, am I going to raise income taxes? Am I going to raise GST? Or am I going to raise petrol taxes? Or am I going to raise alcohol taxes? My submission is very simple, that conditional on a given target of revenue, the petrol tax and the alcohol tax are better forms of tax than income tax and GST, because this is disincentivizing a good, and that is disincentivizing all else equal, something that is generating a negative externality, right? So that's all. So for example, look at say Tamil Nadu versus Bihar, right? I mean, the Bihar model of prohibition is like fiscal folly written all over it, right? Like, I mean, whereas the Tamil Nadu model is saying like, people are going to drink. So instead of taking that underground, like, I mean, the TASMAC system is responsible for a very large part of kind of state revenue in Tamil Nadu, but then they send it back into welfare programs and put money into women's accounts, which is, I think, overall a much, much better way of doing things, like, I mean, in the Bihar model. So anyway, I think there is a meta discussion about the size of the state and the fact that the state is this, and this is classic Musgrave Buchanan, right? Public economics versus public choice. And I think here's the other problem, right? The other problem is where you are in India is, again, because of the political pressures, the pressure on the government doing things is always going to be there. So you and I can sit and have a hypothetical discussion of saying government should not be doing this, but pressure to aayega. Revenue to the taxman is coming after you, you like it or not, okay? So all I'm saying is that holding a revenue envelope constant, the petrol tax is a better way of hitting that than something else, right? So that's all.
Fair enough. But what it really amounts to is, see, I think a tax on petrol is a tax on the poor, because it will have an inflationary effect on everything else. The prices of everything goes up, including the salt and the soap.
But it depends on what you're doing with that revenue, right? So if that revenue is then coming back into funding, say, like, the primary healthcare that the poor use, if the revenue is coming back to fund, say, an extra worker in the ICDS system, then it in net ends up being much more progressive. So again, if you
the thing is, if my aunt was my uncle, she'd be a man. This is like that only.
So I agree, right?
Far-fetched. My point is that what is really happening here is that the rich sitting in their first class in the plane are saying fine, tax the poor. So anyway, but we can discuss this some other time.
But again, it goes back to kind of saying, all I'm saying is, yes, we have a real problem, right? What is interesting is I get attacked from both the left and the right, right? Like, so the left thinks like,
Ditto.
Sorry?
Ditto.
Yeah.
I mean,
right. So I get attacked from the left for pushing so much in terms of cost effectiveness, right? Like, and I get attacked from the right, like, for feeling that I have this naive kind of optimism in the state, right? And so I guess the middle ground I'm trying to occupy is to say, at one level, the state needs to do more things. At another level, it is so inefficient, right? Like, that let's push it to kind of increase on the things that are cost effective, that have high ROI. And then conditional on doing that, like, is it worth funding it? The answer is yes. But just like Ajay said in the context of the book with Kelkar, if the marginal cost of raising every rupee of tax revenue is in fact 3 rupees, then the ROI threshold of what you do with tax revenue needs to be over 3x for you to actually do the tax. So that I'm fully agreed that we should resist kind of a blind expansion of the state because the default quality of expenditure is so bad. Now, you may come back and say that, listen, in fact, I was talking to a finance minister last year who wanted to raise tax revenue. I told him, I said, in good conscience, I cannot just commit to raising revenue unless you commit to me that you're going to do good things with it, because otherwise you're just kind of attacking the poor taxpayer, right? Like, for your next vanity. But this was a government that had some commitment to, service delivery, right? So but that was a side conversation, right? In which we did have. So anyway, so I think coming back to where we are on health policy. And
yeah, I'll put a final aside because you mentioned Ajay's episode, and I'll again point out that Ajay and Vijay Kelkar wrote this great book called In Service of the Republic, and we've discussed this concept of how every rupee spent by the government has an opportunity cost, as it were, of 3 rupees from the economy, 3 rupees of growth. So we discussed that in an episode which I will link from the show notes. And finally, I will just, make one little point that it is not that I am criticizing your optimism of what the state can do. I am saying that, yes, I admire the effort to make the state more responsive and to make it do better things. But that should not take the shape of the assumption that the government will do everything right, which then becomes the justification for all kinds of nonsense.
Absolutely. I agree 100%. Right? But I think,
just as we talk about market failure, we never talk about government failure. We compare market failure with a European idea of what the state will do. But the point is, government failure is more ubiquitous.
Yeah, but I'm not making that case at all, right? Most of my research has in fact been about documenting the government waste, right? So I think in that way, again, my view is closer to Ashwin, right? I mean, that you can't say that, listen, the state does bad things because we are the state, right? I mean, so to somehow, I think to assume that at some level, state karega.
But why? Sorry to interrupt you, but I'll object to that. That saying that we are the state, because you could have made the same argument during the British times. I would argue that the state that we are saddled with today is the same colonial state with a different set of rulers.
But the big difference, again,
So,
now I'm forgetting.
how would that argument have gone down if you were to tell Gandhi or Nehru that, or Savarkar or whoever, that listen, this is.
But
we
here's
are
the big
state.
difference. No, here is the big difference, right? And I can't remember which. I think it was Ajay again who said this, right? Because you keep saying state coercion. I mean, the whole point of a democratic state is that any coercion that happens at the willingness of the people. In fact, one of the sections in my final chapter is on making democracy work better, right? And some of this has to do with institutional rules, reforms, whatever. So essentially, when I'm saying we are the state, I'm just saying that in a democracy, right, if people will not engage, right, you can't then expect that, magically good things are going to happen, right? So that's all. So, a different way of saying this is if the competent refuse to participate, the incompetent will take over, right? I mean, so you can't sit and then complain about what the state is. And which is why my steer to people in civil society who care about improving the public good is, yes, see, in a way, competent people want to kind of be in a setting where their locus of control is high, right? So you don't want to take on the state because it's this beast that is so far outside kind of your grasp, so to speak, right? But again, given that is the beast that is spending these hundreds of thousands of crores, right? The returns to fixing that beast or tweaking that beast to start getting more effective. And like Ashwin said, like starting to engage with local government, starting to engage with the public sphere in your immediate vicinity is in fact a good thing. So in fact, in the education episode, I didn't mention this, but Howard Gardner at Harvard, I think had, recognizing that education is the needs of an education system are different at different parts of the socioeconomic distribution. I think had this wonderful quote once where he said that, listen, first generation learners need like functional skills, right? Middle classes need more engagement. And that's because you're all caught in your own treadmills of, meeting your whatever private deadlines and kind of oblivious to the public. And elites need more ethics, right? Because the elites kind of have the luxury of kind of not being on a daily treadmill. But if you have kind of created a culture where the elites are more about how do I park my money in tax havens. Now, at an individual level, you don't blame them because they're like, okay, this beast of the state is going to waste my money. So, but then you're starting to see, at least in India, a lot of philanthropy, a lot of kind of elites really starting to engage in shaping kind of the larger public ecosystem in which we live in. And so that's my plea. My plea then is to the middle classes to say that we need more engagement, right? I mean, you can't step aside and somehow think, because if you step aside, then your only option is to shrink the state. Because if you're stepping aside, you're basically saying, listen, the state is unredeemable and it is kind of, downward spiral. And then we want to shrink the state and then give up on state capacity altogether, right? So.
Let's move on, but before you move on, one final statement that, I think you're being a little totalitarian when you speak of the people as if it's a monolithic whole and the people voted these people in, or the people keep the state accountable and all of that. That's not true. We have to think at the level of individuals. Mm-hmm. There have been tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of deaths that have been caused in India that are needless because of the apathy and neglect of the dysfunctional state. And I'm sorry, I'm not responsible for that, right? You can say, hey, the people are the state and all of that, but I am simply not, because I have at a personal level been warning that there will be a second wave, been saying vaccinate everyone, been railing against the dysfunctional state ever since I started writing, or possibly since I was in the womb, because that's just what it is. But anyway, as you and I are going to have a continuing discussion
on federal, and the interesting thing is, I don't even think we deeply, fundamentally disagree in terms of the facts, right? I think we actually agree remarkably on what the facts are. And then I think, the creative tension is more in terms of how do you move forward, from this morass, of where we are. So, I don't think I disagree. Yeah, I don't think we disagree on the core diagnosis at all. So.
Yeah. No, I'm with you on the effort that we have to make in reforming the state. But I also anyway, let's leave it for some other discussion, as my whole podcast is a continuing, evolving discussion over hundreds of episodes with different people. So God knows which guest will next contribute to this discussion. Let's move on to the policy.
So then coming back to the policy on healthcare, right? I think so. We've talked a little bit about public finance, public expenditure, and value for money, right? Now, but thinking about the creation of so I'm going to say two or three. I'm going to say a few things on strengthening public systems, and then I'm going to say a few on the private system, given that the private is 75% of actually the distribution of healthcare in the country, right? So on the public side, I think the single most important insight is the following, okay? Which is we have the most expensive part of the healthcare system is the doctor, right? Both in terms of the cost of the training and in terms of the scarcity of supply. Okay. And we are living in this model of saying we're going to provide universal healthcare by staffing rural places with these highly qualified doctors. And that has just not worked, and it is not going to work. Okay. So the way we need to think about building our human resources for healthcare, instead of saying, I'm going to take a talented urban doctor and put them in a rural area, it's like, can I take a talented, motivated rural person and upskill this person in a way that allows them to be effective in their communities? Okay. So I think that's like the core mental shift we need to make. And this is not just me, right? We now have good data and evidence. If you look at what is the part of the healthcare system in India that works best, okay, what works best is we do well on vaccinations, we're doing well on institutional deliveries. Okay, so these key metrics and vaccinations, we managed to do this year after year with kid after kid. Now, why are we succeeding? Is because the most successful part of the healthcare system right now, I would argue, are the ASHA workers. Okay, so the ASHA workers are hired locally in the village. They are typically 8th, 10th, or 12th pass, they're in that range of education. They provided a modest amount of training, and importantly, that they are paid on a piece rate basis, right? So they get a modest stipend, but they are paid for every institutional delivery. They are paid for every vaccination, okay? So which means that you have taken the local talent, you have upskilled them, and you have put them in an overall incentive regime whereby, there is some continuous reward for ongoing performance, okay? This model was developed by Dr. Abhay Bang and Rani Bang, in Gadchiroli district in Maharashtra. They have searched and they've done tons of work over the years of building health systems and capacity in the back of the beyond. So taking that insight into how do we build human resources for kind of the public healthcare system, my most important push would be something very similar to what I said for teachers, right? Which is, think about aggressively expanding nurse training programs, right? But where the nurse training programs should be heavily practicum based, okay? So specifically the model that I have in mind, whether it's for education or for nursing, is to say that imagine at every district level, you create a district nursing college, right? That is equipped to train a few hundred nurses a year. And you say that you're going to admit students, the top candidates from every panchayat, okay? And you will prioritize panchayats where they currently don't have staff, okay, in their health system. So you are getting an inflow of the top talent, 10th pass or 12th pass, as the case might be. And the one good news from expanding school education over the years is now you kind of have at the panchayat level, candidates who have passed 12th. And particularly for girls, this is really important because the cultural barriers to working outside the village means that the labor force participation falls sharply and you kind of get married and have kids at 16 or 18, partly because of that barrier, right? So being able to create the structure whereby you say this is a prestigious program that you're admitted to, where the government is paying your fees, okay? So you're not actually paying out of pocket. But what you're doing over a 3-year or 4-year period is you're saying, I'm going to get 3 months of modular nurse training, okay? That teaches me in terms of the basics. And then 9 months, I'm back in my community, attached to the sub-center, reporting into the PHC. So there's a regular nurse and doctor I'm reporting into. So this then becomes part of your practicum training where you are starting to provide primary care, okay? And you do this for 2 years or 3 years. And then at the end of 3 years, in fact, I can literally imagine, right, that they have their own uniforms and they kind of, sort of in a quasi-official way, you get 1 stripe and 2 stripes and 3 stripes based on how many years of your training you've finished, right? So it also, these little subtle markers of status, right, mean that it gives you certain official recognition in your community, in your village. And so what you're doing, and this is where then technology comes in, right? Because what you're doing is not just doing the 3 months training, but you're then creating these kind of smartphone-based apps as well as, say, peer groups, okay? So that you are constantly exposed and have access to a community of peers as well as your teachers, right? So when you're in practice, you can refer both to your immediate supervisor as well as have access to a virtual network of inputs for how you deal with this. The technology can become incredibly effective as a way of supporting continuing education, okay? So today, you have to pass an exam when you come in, but once you're in the government service for 30 years or 35 years, there is no kind of ongoing test of whether you're current in your knowledge, okay? So again, what the US does is saying doctors have to be recertified every 10 years, okay? Now, we don't have the apparatus to do that. But imagine that now every nurse in your government system, right, has a unique ID and they are expected to do a certain, say, 10 or 15 days of training a year. But now the training is essentially on an app where you have curated content and then at the end of every module of the content, you have a test, okay? So you can take this on your own time. And in fact, my chapter on police, I talk about the same thing, right? That one of the reasons our police are so horrendously undertrained is because the nature of their job is they have to be on call. Okay, so they have to be available, and they are so understaffed. The system cannot spare these poor cops like to go attend a training workshop, right? But if you can modularize the training to fit it into the downtime during the day when they're sitting in the thana, just waiting for things to happen, right? So, and that's the same for nurses. It's the same for a lot of service delivery staff. That there's a lot of downtime, right? When you're just sitting there waiting for a patient to come in, there are some times when you have a lot of load, sometimes when you're just sitting twiddling your thumbs. Okay, so how do you use that time efficiently? By kind of having modular training that you can take, and you take an exam that you show you have this done. So, and then once you've done this kind of modular nurse training, you give them a nursing credential. And the good thing about this is this is then valuable in both the public sector and the private sector, right? So because the private sector is 70% of the system, you can say that you are creating the human capital, the human resources to absorb into the public system and post them in the subcenters and areas that are underserved. But at a point, you're also creating the talent that allows the private sector to absorb them as well, right? So coming back to what the government can do, something that Ajay said again, is that the short-run elasticity of medical workers is basically zero, right? You can't manufacture a doctor in a crisis. You can't manufacture. So the most important lesson from all of this is how do we build the pipeline of human resources for the healthcare sector, but do this in a way that doesn't make the mistake of saying that I need super fancy qualified doctors everywhere. What you really need is kind of the locally connected public health worker who is then trained and leveraged with technology, to kind of have access to. And then this is a person who knows when they need to refer a complicated case, right? So coming back to doing your diagnostics, doing your checklist, doing a bunch of things, the technology then becomes a force multiplier that you put on top of the human resource over there, right? So that would probably be the single most important thing I would do, is to kind of massively expand. So going back to your question of a philanthropist with $100 million, so I would actually say, creating these modular training programs and the templates for this, and working particularly in states like UP and Bihar, to say, how do you make these things happen? And in the beginning, you will need to bring, you'll need to import your trainers. You'll need to have some high quality people creating the content and the modules and stuff like that. But fundamentally, right, 90% of our problems in India are about supply constraints, right? You expand supply and then, the prices will fall and things will take care of themselves. So I think that's one core point. Now, a similar point with regard to doctors, is what Chhattisgarh did with kind of their rural medical assistant program. And I sent you that paper as well. So this they had done for 2 or 3 years, where you say, again, you don't need this fully trained doctor sitting in the rural area twiddling their thumbs, but can you modularize the training and provide enough medical training that they can be more effective? Yeah, and I think, coming to doctor training, I think the same thing applies in the Chhattisgarh experiment, which was unfortunately stopped after 2 or 3 years for, I think, complex political reasons. But the core idea was very, very simple, that you don't need this fancy 6 years of training and put an MBBS in a remote rural area where this person has no inclination to be and is not being effectively utilized, right? So they had this rural medical assistant program where you had people trained for about 3 years and then were eligible to practice in the rural areas, right? So you have to start thinking creatively about expanding the supply in a way that the most important mistake, let me repeat again and again, and this is true with all of our public sector recruitment, and that's because we recruit on the basis of a test, on the basis of knowledge. The people who will get this, pass the exam, will almost invariably be from urban areas. And even those who get in from other areas, the salaries will be so high that their aspirations will be urban. So a big part of the absence problem is not that people are bad, it's that they're just completely disconnected from the communities they're serving, right? So to kind of take what we've learned from the ASHA model, to say, take local talent that is connected to the community and invest in upskilling them in a way that there's a pipeline from the skilling to the employment, I think is one of the most important structural points we need to do in terms of building our healthcare capacity. Again, these are more complex kind of reforms. Now, the other thing that is immediately actionable for a government, given that at the end of the day, governments, they know how to build things, they know how to kind of just, do more of the same, The one thing I would say, which Abhishek Banerjee has also written about, is particularly in UP, Bihar and places where the population has grown so much over the past kind of 20, 30 years, that there is a strong case for building a second district hospital, right? Because right now you have one district hospital, but has been there since the 70s and the population has doubled, Now, the nice thing about a district hospital is you have scale. And when you have scale, you can have kind of the community of practice. The absence is typically much, much lower in these district hospitals compared to the remote rural areas. The utilization is higher. And it also becomes possible to then do my third idea, which is kind of attach medical colleges, right? Because the medical education problem, so I'll come back to that, right? So the second thing is build district hospitals. This is something the government knows how to do. Just do it, build a second district hospital in kind of the second nodal area. And given the investment in roads and people's willingness to travel, that's a case where concentrating your resources in a scale facility makes more sense than saying, I'm going to build these itsy bitsy little PHCs that nobody goes to. Okay. So that's the second point. The third, then coming to medical education itself. And if you go back to the Two Indias paper, I think one of the big reasons for why you see this massive gradient in healthcare quality is the substantial investment in medical education in the southern states. Now, some of this is driven by private investment, which reflects the fact that it's expensive and the southern states are richer, and so people are just able to pay more. Okay. But from a policy perspective, medical education is controlled pretty much by the government. Now, of course, there's a ton of rent seeking there, and and that's been, the tragedy. But hopefully this is a crisis where the chief minister says, okay, boss, I'm not going to allow rent seeking here because this is now really important. And then the three things that determine kind of your medical education capacities, there's the facilities, there is there's the actual human capital, right? I mean, who are the people available to do the training? And typically these have been attached to district hospitals, partly because that's where you have the doctors available. So I think on the public system, those would be kind of the three things I would do as far as healthcare is concerned. Now, there is obviously the technology piece of this, and there is a question about, does the public system have the dexterity and the speed to kind of really leverage technology the way you want to at scale? So I think one thing which I haven't discussed in the book, but just like I had done in the case of charter schools in the private school, there may well be a case to kind of partner with public-spirited foundations to come and say that if you were to kind of take over a management contract, okay, for running a public health system in one district, right? So it would still be public in the sense that you wouldn't turn away patients, you wouldn't charge fees, but you would basically bring in a publicly motivated person to come and look at the technology and innovation landscape and saying, how would I re-architect the system with modern principles of technology and private sector, right? So, and I don't think we've done enough of that. I think we've done PPPs in terms of outsourcing, say, tertiary care and saying in Ayushman Bharat or Arogya Shri that we will reimburse private hospitals. What we have not done enough of is saying, can I bring real private sector management expertise and horsepower into re-engineering the public system to leverage technology and do things at scale, right? So I think that might be something else that's really, really worth thinking about.
So many things to unpack there, but I won't unpack too many of them because you've been so sort of clear and concise. But I will point out that one thing that delighted me was that I asked Ajay a question in the last episode about philanthropist and 100 million, and you picked up on it in this episode and answered it without my asking it, which I find delightful, which is, that's how I like to see the seen and the unseen, a conversation that goes across time and across episode and across guests. So I wonder what question that I asked you will be answered by some other guest. Who knows, maybe we could have an answer next week. I also want to quote a little bit from your Two Indias paper, because just for the listeners to clarify that there's a lot of activity happening at the local level, which isn't exactly the same, that the state also is not a monolithic beast just as individuals are. So you speak about the different views of primary healthcare, and you say, quote, one view of primary care in rural India is that it is available mainly through publicly operated private healthcare centers or sub-centers, which are sparsely located and understaffed. According to this view, qualified doctors in India are mostly located in urban locations and access to quality care in India is poor. Stop quote. And the other view is, quote, an alternate view agrees that even though access to qualified providers in rural India is low, a wide variety of healthcare providers with diverse qualifications has arisen to fill this gap. Stop quote. And what I found interesting was how you detailed out how different states are treating this differently, this situation, in the sense that, West Bengal is trying to train them. Chhattisgarh, like you said, is reducing requirements, making it modular and saying, okay, you don't have to do all 6 years, you can just do 3 years or whatever. You talk about how UP and MP are increasing transportation, so that's how your access goes up. You don't need a doctor there immediately. And how the government of India is allowing alternate medicine docs in wellness centers. And I love this quote that, you quoted the Indian Medical Association, which is resisting this, obviously, because they want to keep it supply as restricted as possible. And you've written, quote, in their view, for instance, training informal sector providers is like teaching burglars to steal better. Stop quote. I love that quote. Teaching burglars to steal better. Isn't this what the IAS Academy in Mussoorie does? But never mind.
No, to be fair.
I'm kidding.
Yeah.
This is... my distrust of the dysfunctional state has also become a kind of a meme, I guess, of sorts. There's lots to think about. And once again, what I will say from having read these papers and having read the chapter in your book, but even the papers itself, even your Two Indias paper, is that there's a lot of depth and nuance there. And so I would just encourage listeners to get into the weeds, because this is a problem, I think, that is not just a problem for academics and policymakers. It concerns all of us. We've seen that in this specific season, all our lives are affected, the quality of our lives, and sometimes our very lives themselves. So do check out those papers and go a little bit into the weeds. It's worth it. There are a lot of insights there for me. Let me turn your attention now to the current crisis, to COVID. And of course, I have done many episodes on this, and there are just like so many aspects of this to talk about. But I have spoken about the economics aspects of this, the policy making aspects of this, all the
So
different...
one thing before COVID, because I had finished the public part of the policy, maybe I'll take 5 minutes to talk about the private part of policy.
Let's go.
Let's do that, and then come back to COVID. Right? Because I think and again, see, in many ways, the episodes that I'm doing in education and health are kind of mirroring the structure of the book, in the sense that the book has these 6 thematic chapters, and the themes then cut across 6 different sectors. So in that way, you'll see the parallels that are happening here. And one of the most important kind of points I want to make is, and this is to any health minister or health secretary anywhere who may be listening to this at some point, is that the biggest kind of, I would say, myopia we have in health policy is that the government, for the most part, only thinks about its job as running the public system. Okay, whereas we need the clarity again that the government plays 3 very different roles in the ecosystem, right? As a policymaker, as a regulator, and as a provider. And the way you see the private sector is very different in these 3 lenses, right? So as a policymaker, the private sector is your ally, because your job is to improve outcomes for everybody, regardless of who provides it. As a regulator, the private sector is equal to the public, because you want to treat them equally. And as a provider, they are your competitor. Okay. Now, the problem is that the government, the majority of its staff and human resources are thinking and functioning as government as provider, right? And so, which means you automatically distrust the private sector. You automatically want to kind of cramp them in multiple ways, and and sometimes justified, because of course these are profit. For every good private guy, there's an equally bad private guy. So, and policy making by anecdote, you can do whatever you want, right? Because you can find any story to justify what you want to do. Okay. So, but coming back to the stark reality that 75% of healthcare in this country is delivered by the private sector. Okay. If you are a thinking health minister or health secretary tomorrow who says that I care about improving my health systems, the elephant in the room are these private guys. Okay. So what are you going to do about them? Okay. Now, yeah, so the default approach to the private sector is basically to pretend that they don't exist, okay, because they're illegal, they're not supposed to be practicing, and every once in a while you'll have these drives of going and shutting down these clinics, okay. But the problem is they will come back a week later or 2 weeks later, because they're in the community, they are highly respected, they're the only source of care, and so there is demand, right? I mean, so, and I think the denial we are in is really, really counterproductive, given that if we care about population health, the largest segment are these folks, okay? So what would I do? And this is where, again, we have evidence, okay? So there's this lovely paper, again, by Jishnu and Abhijit Banerjee and co-authors in Bengal, right? I mean, where they partnered with the Liver Foundation, and they ran this program, again, it was a randomized control trial of basically training these unqualified providers, okay? So they ran a modular training over about a 9-month period. And the whole point was to say, listen, you are in the community, you care about doing well, so can we give you some basic training? And just does that make you better? Okay. And what they found was that this modest training had a substantial positive impact, right, on their effectiveness as measured by standardized patients. And it almost halved the gap between the completely unqualified and the fully qualified in about 9 months of training. Okay. So coming back, therefore, to this core point that I made, that quality is a function of knowledge and effort, right? Public sector has high knowledge, low effort. Private sector has low knowledge, high effort. Okay. So if you do a simple partial derivative, I'll ask your audience to do in their heads, right? The partial derivative of quality with respect to effort is knowledge, right? And vice versa. So which means the returns to knowledge is actually higher in the private sector because the effort is high. Whereas the returns to effort is higher in the public sector because the knowledge is high, right? So if you want to think about system architecture, we need to be thinking about how do you improve the incentives and accountability in the public sector, and how do you improve the knowledge in the private sector. Whereas in practice, we do exactly the opposite, right? I mean, because we say the private guys, we ignore them, and we keep doing trainings of various sorts, right? Like in the public sector, okay? So Now, of course, this is politically fraught, right? Because it will obviously be like opposed by different kind of interest groups. And so it's very important to be very clear that I'm not talking about training these guys and calling them doctors, okay? Like, I mean, it is going back to the spirit of modular training, recognizing that, listen, these guys are in the community. They are respected. They don't want to do bad, right? I mean, the last thing they want is to hurt their patients because they're living in the community, correct? So giving them the ability to kind of be better and be able to refer complex cases almost says that, listen, these private guys exist anyway, okay? So why not leverage them to be like the first point of kind of a structure of care whereby I train them to say, okay, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And now here are things that you can do. Now, there is a question about what credential you give them. Like, maybe you create a cadre of paramedics or a cadre of like, something that provides a certain legitimacy but doesn't say like, that, but then you say if you call yourself doctor, like, then I'll penalize you. So again, I can just give you principles, right? Now, the details of this will then have to be worked out in specific states, specific contexts. Now, one way to hybridize the two ideas I talked about was to say, suppose we have a modular training program for nurses, or we have this RMA training program, okay, whereby say we are going to create these 2-year programs or diplomas for these rural medical assistants. Then in terms of who gets admission into that program, one route could be to say you do well in a 12th standard exam. The other route could be that if you are one of these unqualified but registered medical practitioners who's been in your community for 10 years, that maybe we'll give you some preferential access into this 2-year training program, okay, so that we are able to take that informal workforce and start giving them some formal skills, okay? So that would be one piece of how you may take this private system and make it function better, okay, in a way that is constructive, as opposed to saying, Acha, I'm going to play whack-a-mole with you and shut you down, but then you'll pop up in another place, okay? So that's one idea. Then I think the other things in the private sector, one is obviously, I think something Ajay alluded to. You see, the biggest challenge in designing healthcare systems is at one level, you want some incentives for good care. At another level, you don't want the incentives to be too strong for over-medication, right? So structurally, one way to do this is if you have insurance companies that are essentially signing agreements with providers, okay, and saying that you are my designated provider. Now, what happens is the members of the policy at the beginning of every year have a chance to choose their provider. But the good news is you're now choosing not when you are sick and need to be hospitalized, when you have very little bargaining power and very little time. You are choosing at a time when you have kind of the ability to think about your way. So the practice then has an incentive to have a reputation for providing a certain standard of care. Because if you are somebody who's seen as crimping, then people will not choose you. But the way you compensate the practice is not by saying, I'm going to pay you for procedure. You say, I pay you a certain amount for every patient you enroll in the course of a year, so that you are not incentivized to overtreat, right? So again, if you think about, say, the British National Health System, the NHS has a similar, so as a doctor, as a primary care practitioner, you get paid a certain piece rate for every patient who signs up with your practice. But then your reimbursements are relatively flat, right? So you don't get a steep gradient for doing too many procedures. So again, going back to what Ajay said, these are incredibly complex issues, and, Western countries have entire communities of health economists, like who are, working with common data sets and starting to, these are incredibly complex design detailed questions, right? But the broad architecture would take that form, that you say one of the ways to solve this asymmetry problem is you put a kind of a bigger buyer on the other side, and over time you create the right incentives for the overall ecosystem. And the last thing I would do, going back to ideas for your hypothetical philanthropist with $100 million, is that there are a lot of light touch investments we can make that allow markets to function better, okay? Even without being directly in the business of provision or insurance or reimbursement, okay? So part of the problem today is we have no transparent source of data on who the providers are. So if you're sitting in your city, you have no idea who's practicing around you, right? And so now there are companies, obviously information is valuable, right? So there are companies that have tried to set up a business, say, I think in education, I was looking for some schools, and then you get these private companies that say school ratings. But then the revenue model for them is either the school or the hospital is paying to get rated, and then you have the agency problem that you had with, say, credit ratings, or the user is paying to access that, which means it is restricted in the user base, whereas information is fundamentally a public good. So as in public good in the sense that once you've created it, the marginal cost of spreading it is zero, right? So if a government won't do this, which they should, but don't have the capacity or the money to do, one incredibly leveraged thing philanthropy can do is just come and create kind of open source information platforms, like that allows you to just crowdsource over time, saying who are all the providers in a given market, right? Now, and then over time, you could have like a small cadre of dedicated staff who will then go and do field verification of each of these guys, right? So make it a positive revelation game for people to want to be listed on the portal as somebody who's providing services with a certain level of kind of qualifications or basic details of what their practice is. But I think we underestimate the value of just good information. Okay, so Jishnu has a series of very nice papers in Pakistan looking at information on school quality, right? And what they find is just providing better information on school quality without any additional money, right, leads to huge downstream positive impacts over time, because it just, it makes the market much more transparent, and it forces you to react to kind of what is possible and what you see in the market. So let me stop there. I have even more ideas, but I think these are enough to kind of, clarifying some of these conceptual issues and hopefully providing some direction of where we need to go.
No, these are stimulating ideas, and I hope young entrepreneurs listening to this can take inspiration from this. Why do you need a philanthropist necessarily throwing $100 million or the evil dysfunctional state coming in and saying, we can do it, we'll show Amit that we can also do some work. Where is a private enterprise? There are so many areas to fix here. These are the problems worth solving. So kindly come in and try that, is my message to all young entrepreneurs listening to this. You are giving messages to health minister through my show. Boss, what are you even thinking? But never mind. Maybe the person who will be health minister of India in 2035 is listening to this now. So kindly, I hope your retention is good. Let's talk about...
But the podcast will still be available. I think, one of the things I think you mentioned in your chat with Milan Vaishnav, I think after the first episode with Pratap, is that, the point in some ways, yes, I think it makes sense to discuss health right now when we're in the COVID moment, but it's almost more effective, I think, rather than making prognosis in the fog of war, to kind of focus on the first principles of just the larger structure, and these things will then, play through regardless.
Yeah, like my conceit was that I am making episodes for 30 years later. So I don't want to go across space. I also want to go across time. And of course, it is possible. One reason I came up with that highfalutin idea was because I thought no one will listen to me in the present time. But clearly that is not the case. People listen. I think the idea to create timeless content is great. And that's also why it's so wonderful that you've come on the show twice. Because I think both of these episodes, education and healthcare, are almost so useful in terms of providing foundational understanding. While we aim for the timeless, we also have to address the times. So let's kind of get to COVID now. Now on COVID, I've done episodes with economists of various types. I've done, episodes on it with relief workers who are out there feeding people, with data journalists, with epidemiologists, with scientists who are, good at describing what the virus is. But even though you don't call yourself a healthcare economist, you're probably the closest to that definition, with whom I guess Ajay also to a fair extent, because you're both economists interested in, who have looked deeply into healthcare. So what's your sense? Like, what could we have done differently which is not obvious in hindsight?
Yes, I think I don't want to do Monday morning quarterbacking, because I think while there is a space for accountability in our public discourse, I think the problem when you kind of, and that's important, right? This is not to say that there shouldn't be accountability for people who are asleep at the wheel. But when in this moment, right, when you go down that road, you essentially create defensiveness, right? And so I would like to kind of unapologetically focus on what do we do today and going forward, right? What has happened, right? So I think there are really just 3 points, right? Which is, last year we thought about ventilators. This year we are focusing on oxygen, okay? Which is visceral, because you see people dying and you kind of immediately see that I need to get oxygen. That's important, right? But I think the most important message, again, is what is the public health and what are the things that the government should be doing that, and again, optimizing the cost. See, I remember reading somewhere, right, that in a war, any decision you make is going to have some casualties, okay? Because there are only bad choices, right? So the point of leadership in a fog of war is to assess the risks and kind of be able to take a reasonable decision that is informed by the best information available with a certain amount of transparency so that the public continues to have confidence in the leadership, right? And I think that is something which I will definitely say has been lacking, and consistency of communication and transparency to the public about where we are and where we are going, I think is incredibly important. So that being said, I would really just say three things, okay? So there is obviously a piece of what we need to do that is just on the sheer logistics of hospital beds or oxygen and stuff like that. And even there, I think the important things are not so much getting somebody oxygen on Twitter, like you said, because like Ajay was saying, that means somebody else is not getting it. It's really intervening to reduce the frictions, right? Is there excess oxygen somewhere and somebody needing it somewhere else? Is there oxygen going to places where there is no trained operator to use it, right? So we need kind of mindful interventions because there's complementarities across these different pieces. And so that I think is important. But I would say the single most important thing we need to do. See, the end game is vaccines, okay? There's no question. But the vaccines are going to take a minimum of 6 to 9 months to roll out across the population, okay? So what do we have evidence on today is the one thing that the country should just be doing on a war footing is masking, okay? Because we know a lot more about this disease in the past year. We spent a lot of time cleaning surfaces. We spent a lot of time doing other things. What we now know is that the vast majority of transmission is airborne. This is fundamentally an airborne disease. And it is completely, unglamorous, simple, but it works, okay? And so the surgical masks, they just work. Now, and again, this is a case where unfortunately, I think the public messaging was a little mixed in the beginning because WHO in the beginning said masks are not needed, but that's because they were trying to save masks for the healthcare workers. So that was a case where I think the communication was actually wrong because it gave the sense that it was not needed. It is unambiguously clear that you need the masks, that they work, okay? And we now have the supply elasticity of that is basically infinite. You can get those masks at scale, okay? So what we need is just a very simple public communication to the nation and maybe by chief ministers, if not at the national level, to just say the following three things, right? Which is saying that the lockdown is an incredibly costly last option. The big cities are doing this because we have no choice for 2 weeks. But the end game is going to come when everybody is vaccinated. And between now and everybody being vaccinated, we need everybody to essentially take the masking seriously. I would say the government should spend the money it takes to procure masks. So my contemporary Mushfiq Mubarak, who's basically my batchmate, who's a professor of economics at Yale from Bangladesh. So in the past 1 year, he has put together a consortium of kind of engineers, medical experts from Stanford across universities, and they've really been doing a lot of research on masking, and both in terms of what is the most effective type of mask, right? The surgical mask, what kind of filters, and they've been doing a lot of work on testing different models of behavior change communication. So they've done randomized controlled trials now in Bangladesh with different villages doing different models, and they now have enough results from this. I think that paper will be forthcoming in Science soon. And they've done a series of kind of webinars, I think, in India. But the steps are very, very clear, right? Literally go door to door in every village, right? Procure 4 masks per family, give them the mask. And now, why does the giving the mask matter? It matters because not only are you signaling to every citizen that this is important, that the government is doing this, but you are also making it common knowledge that everybody has gotten the mask, okay? So it's no longer acceptable to be around without the mask because the government has come and hand-delivered this at your door, right? So they have procured a washable mask. And so this is washable, but a set of 4 means you wear a different one every week. You wash them and wear that. Then there is this piece about you need an all of government approach on this, that it's not just the health workers, but it's the gram, it's the panchayat. And in a way, the rural areas are even more important, right? Because the healthcare infrastructure in the urban areas, at least you can do something about. In the rural areas, you don't even have the health infrastructure. So prevention is your only game in town, okay? So you need an all hands on government approach saying between the health workers, the ASHA workers, the Anganwadi workers, the ANMs, the village sarpanch, all of the ward members, the Panchayati Raj officials, all hands on deck, right? This is an all of government approach to saying, we're going to get you the masks and this is going to happen. Get the communication going in a standardized way. Use your film stars, use your cricketers, use whatever to just kind of reinforce again and again and again that just the basics of the disease, right? And sometimes repetition is good. That have the simple graphs that says this is fundamentally airborne. So, obviously the epidemiologists need to worry a lot about variants and sequencing and what is happening. But for the Aam Janta, that is irrelevant, right? What is relevant is that this is an airborne disease, and the way you kind of contain spread is making universal masking till everybody's vaccinated. That's it. And a simple way of saying this, one thing I feel strongly about is that the 35,000 crore cost of universal vaccination, I mean, it's rounding error, right? Like, I mean, compared to the cost of the disease or the cost of a lockdown. I think a nationwide lockdown costs about 200,000 crores a week, okay? And if vaccinating everybody costs 35,000 crores, like, you should just write a check from the government of India, not even ask a question and just get it done, right? So similarly at a state level, if it's, I think our estimate and the masking right now is that it'll cost maybe 50 to 100 crores, like, to do the procurement and just get this done. But the cost of a lockdown in an average size Indian state is about 2,000 crores a week, right? I mean, 2,000 crores a day, about somewhere between 1,000 2,000 crores, depending on the intensity of the lockout. So, and this is essentially, I feel so strongly about this because this is the core point of public health versus curative health, right? Which we've talked about throughout this class. So, sorry, I almost feel like class bana diya isko. Nahin, but
I'm perfectly happy to be a student in your class. No issues. Yeah. We are all, me and all my listeners, we are the biggest class you've ever had, probably.
This is true. But no, I think, but this is why I think it's useful to understand the first principles and then be able to apply those first principles to the problem at hand, right? The first principles is the ROI and spending on public health dwarfs, so tomorrow, now we are already talking about needing to do cash transfers to kind of alleviate the suffering from job loss. Absolutely, that's correct. But that palliative measure is going to cost you already 10 times, 15 times, 20 times what it will cost you to do universal, accelerate vaccinations in every possible way and get the universal masking going for the next 6 to 9 months, right? I mean, and think about it this way. If there was an enemy at the border, during wars, I remember my grandfather, my mother remembers growing up in Agartala in 1971, during that 71 war. And yeah, there would be these sirens, there would be blackouts, when there's kind of enemy air sorties coming and every single person would turn their lights off, right? Because you knew that one light on was kind of enough to give the whole game away, right? I mean, and so, but if you look at the statistics, pandemics kill, we've lost more people in the 1918 to 1920 kind of, Spanish flu in India than 10 times more than World War I and World War II put together, right? So why are we not treating it with that level of urgency where the only contribution we're asking every citizen to do is wear that mask and wear it at every single point when you're outside, avoid the large gatherings, and the government can kind of help and accelerate this by procuring and door distributing 4 masks to every family and just make it happen, right? I mean, so that's the one thing which I feel very confident about saying that we just simply have to do. I won't get into politics of vaccine pricing and procurement and all of that. I think Ajay's talked about that. But, I would just say, regardless of what formula we use, Government of India, state governments, just spend the money it takes to get the vaccines done and kind of don't try to nickel and dime and get poor patients to pay 500 or 1,000 rupees. It's kind of completely foolhardy.
So you mentioned a term there which kind of triggered a memory of a recent news headline, which is you said panchayat. And I thought of how in UP, these 700 teachers died because they were sent on panchayat duty. Because the UP government refused to, postpone the elections. They sent these teachers on government duty. They died. In fact, a recent report from May 6 says it's more than 1,000 by now, the death toll. And there was a story of a woman who, her husband couldn't go because he was literally on his deathbed. He ended up dying, I think. And she was asked by the government that why is your husband not coming for duty? And she had to send a photograph of him on his hospital bed as proof. Something of that sort. And to me, that's murder, by the way, plain and simple. Murder by the state. And that kind of leads me to the thought that, of course, I agree with you. We should do universal masking. But what we're really talking about here is two things, information and messaging. That this is a correct information we should get out there, but this is messaging which should be done in the public interest. What we instead see, the kind of messaging that we see is actually spreading the wrong kind of information. Like Coronil is good for you, that Ayurvedic thing and that will cure you. Or there will be a godman who will say that there's no problem with oxygen, you just need to learn how to breathe, right? And you need to do these yoga poses and all that. And for once I'm moving away, by the way, you will note, from criticizing the state to criticizing society itself, because our society, honestly, we elites in the first class of this plane and all that, we might think that we read books, we read papers. In your case, you write papers, and we are all okay, but we are a very backward country. Look at the things we believe. it seems to me to be an insurmountable challenge at two levels. And I don't mean to be negative and say that we shouldn't try at all.
Yeah.
Let
No,
us.
and so in fact, I had not intended to talk about, say, Indian systems of healthcare or alternative systems of healthcare. But let me say, I think one important point here, right? Which is, see, I think if you read Sanjay Baru's recent book, see, a big part of the current dispensation in government is something that reflects this deep sense of angst that the greatness of Indian history, right, and traditions and cultures, are being undervalued by modernity. And I think some of this is language, right? That the English speaking class has been, we have been incredibly remiss, I think, in not getting scientific content, right? Out in local languages in a way that it's much more accessible. So, and in fact, when I started writing my column in HT, one of the reasons I picked HT was I spent a lot of time trying to translate and write in Hindi, in Hindustan. But it turned out too technical, and I think they told me, "Hey, boss, you'll have to simplify this." But that's a separate story. But at least the intent was there, okay? But I think here's the point I want to make is that, see, modern clinical trials, okay? So I do RCTs for a living. I believe in RCTs, and it came from medicine, okay? But that being said, there is one big blind spot, right? Which is conditional on doing a particular study, we randomize the treatment and saying, did this treatment have an effect? Okay. But the universe of treatments that get evaluated by RCTs is highly selective, right? So what determines what gets evaluated, correct? So now, to me, the right way of bridging, I would say, the tradition and the strength we have in our traditional systems. See, here is my view of our traditional systems, is that a lot of it may be quackery, a lot of it may be placebo. But just by natural selection, okay, the fact that something has survived for 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years means that there is likely to be some survivorship bias, okay, that if people say take ginger or take turmeric or take honey, right, that is not pharmaceutically done, but that has a bunch of, so my throat after talking 4 hours, what am I drinking? I'm just drinking honey water, with herbal tea, right? So, but where I think we need to really be thoughtful about bridging the greatness of our traditions with the modern scientific standards is to say, instead of claiming that we had all of these great things in plastic surgery in the back days, say, here is a body of traditional knowledge that we can now invest in testing, with more modern scientific methods and then validate rather than waiting for Western pharmaceutical companies to come and patent Neem and Isabgol, right? All these kind of things that we've been doing traditionally, so in that way, we've known it works. So why leave it to the Westerners to come and bring modern science to our traditions as opposed to taking the traditions and meeting the science and getting the best of both worlds? And the Chinese have been very good at this. I forget the name of the scientist, but somebody who won a Nobel Prize, for medicine actually did exactly this, right? Take a bunch of traditional medicine, but then validate, and some of these will not be true. Okay, the whole point of the modern RCTs is some of these will in fact have been placebos or folk wisdom, but some of them will turn out to be very effective. I share your despair at pop science, and the marketing around it. But I think it's important to recognize the source of cultural angst, right? Of where it comes from, and then find a constructive way to channel that angst in a way that reflects a modern scientific temperament.
Yeah, look, I have nothing but respect for the conservative view that if something has worked over the centuries, there's a reason it's a survivorship bias, putting haldi in doodh when you're ill and all that, it's fine. I'm cool with that. I have an issue with things like this coronal stuff or, a yogic pose will solve your oxygen problem, which to me is just offensive to the people who actually suffer from it. I have a problem with those, but that's a separate issue. Two of the major problems that I have with, our modern times have been expressed by us in this episode, which is the incentives problem and the narratives problem, and neither of those is going to go away anytime soon. So, but before I let you go, let's turn away from healthcare for a moment. What have you been reading recently outside of work? Let's say, what are the last 3 books which filled you with joy, or which you thoroughly enjoyed, which you can recommend to me and my listeners? Except that, kindly don't put some random academic thing and say, no, I got joy from this and all that. No. Outside of that.
So here's the bad news and the good news. Okay, so the bad news is I have not actually done much reading in the past year and a half because I've mainly been reading things around my book. The good news is that my main source of new knowledge has been listening to podcasts, including yours, right? And so one of my routines here in this pandemic, and again, San Diego, it's interesting you mentioned Eric Topol, right? Because he's here in San Diego. And San Diego is just like a magical place to be in some ways, right? Because you can just go out on long walks. And so, yeah, my source of absorbing new knowledge in the pandemic has actually been been primarily audio and podcasts. Okay, so yeah, so if somebody else would ask me, I would say go listen to a bunch of seen and unseen episodes. And I'm not saying this to flatter you because I had not done it in 180 at the time I did the first one, but I have done, as you can see from the connections I'm making.
Okay, what are your favorite episodes? Chalo. What are your favorite episodes?
I mean, obviously the one with Pratap was a classic, I mean, that happened immediately after mine. I enjoyed the one with Vinay Sitapati a lot, though, I mean, I did think it kind of, I would say, whitewashed a little bit, of kind of the larger narrative, of the rise of the RSS. But I think overall, I really enjoyed hearing the bit about the combination of legal, journalistic, and scholarly training in that book, right? And so I can see the lack of the journalistic training in my own writing, because I'll do the fact checking in the same rigor as an academic, but I haven't learned the craft of storytelling in my writing nearly as much, right? So that piece is a lot more work for me because, I get the content right, but then I have to simplify, which is why I'm still saying I might do 4 podcasts and say, "Arey, book chodo yaar."
You're most welcome to please write the book, but you're also welcome as a supplementary effort, a supplementary teacher training, you can say. You can come on.
But I enjoyed that in terms of the process of writing. I've enjoyed your recent scientific ones, with again, I keep calling him Bhalo Manush, but Anirban, right? I think that was fun. I think just going back or Gautam, hearing people talk about the joy of science, and I mean, I'm a nerd, I'm an academic at heart, so here as a way of kind of learning, people who have been at the cutting edge of other disciplines talking about their work, I think that's the part I've really enjoyed.
Well, I think many listeners of the Seen and the Unseen would actually say that you are one of their favorite guests. So once again, thank you so much for coming on the show. And I hope our conversation keeps continuing over the months. And good luck with your book. And take good care of yourself, as Amitabh Bachchan says on KBC. And take good care of yourself. What else does he say? That Shabba Khair line?
हाँ मतलब गाना तो है मेरे यार शबा खैर दिन सारा गुजारा तोरे अंगना.
No, at the end of KBC he used to say that he used to say a line which had Shabba Khair at the end of it. It was quite a flourish.
Actually, on our past episode, I think somebody had kind of commented there saying, "Acha, this was a Bollywood length effort. Why not put in a few song and dance also?"
Do you sing? Would you like to sing?
Exactly. No. So what I'm going to sing is I'm going to sing a line for you which reflects, I think, the writer's angst, but it's also, one of my favorite. So it's this line from In Custody and Muhafiz, right? Which is, "Aaj ek harf ko phir dhoondta phirta hai khayal," right? Which is the poet writing that I have this thought that is running around, looking for the right word to land on, right? So when I kind of talk in high school sometimes about Indian education systems that obsesses so much on science and math, I kind of keep emphasizing language because the precision of your thinking is limited by the precision of your language, right? And so that's kind of the dominant emotion as I write, right? Because you'll spend kind of sometimes hours grappling for kind of the right phrase, the right sentence to get something done. But yeah, so I tick that musical box. पिछले बार तमिल में बात किया, इस बार गाना गा लिया.
Lovely, amazing. Muhafiz, of course, was one of the rare films which Ismail Merchant directed himself instead of his partner James Ivory doing that. Anything else you'd like to sing, boss? You have a good voice here.
So among the unknown things about me is back in high school, right? I used to be an inter-school Antakshari champion. Wow.
So I'm going to give you a letter and you got to sing something with that, okay?
हो जाएगा but show पे नहीं यार.
नहीं अभी एक दो लाइन गा दो. I'll give you a letter. ठीक है? क्या letter दूँ? तुम्हारे नाम का letter देता हूँ. क.
अरे नहीं यार. Don't do this to me.
Come on. This is our listeners will love it. K. चलो. K or M? I'll give you an option because both are your name only. M say, so many songs will start with ma'am.
No, there's no shortage of songs. So in fact, see, here's the tragedy of my Antakshari past also. My teammates, there were 3 of us, okay? So the other 2 had much better voices, okay? So I was the quantity guy, they were the quality people, okay? So what I would often do is essentially when the other team would start singing, I would already know what it's going to end in. So I will say, "Acha, ye gana hai," and pass it to my teammate who had the better voice for that particular song. So I was kind of the intellectual kind of leader of the team.
I'm not letting you get away, bro. I'm sorry. This episode is not airing. K or M. I've given you an option, bro.
No, then, if I want to get very melancholic on the K, I would say कभी खुद पे कभी हालात पे रोना आया कभी खुद पे. And I say that because, the halat have truly been like, Rona inducing.
Indeed.
So I think part of the problem was, most of my initial songs with Kerr and Mer were happy songs and I couldn't automatically bring myself to sing those. And I think the halat have been really hard because, I had wanted to travel back and I've not been able to travel back, and you kind of pray every day for safety of friends and family. So maybe we all survive and get through to the other side and then hopefully build a better Indian state.
Well, the halat may make us cry, but you give us hope. So thanks so much, Karthik.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode, do visit the show notes and dive into rabbit holes. You can follow Karthik on Twitter at Karthik_econ. You can follow me at Amit Varma, AMITVARMA. You can browse past episodes of The Seen and the Unseen at seenunseen.in. Thank you for listening. Did you enjoy this episode of The Seen and the Unseen? If so, would you like to support the production of the show? You can go over to seenunseen.in/support and contribute any amount you like to keep this podcast alive and kicking. Thank you.